Chapter 152. After the beginning of spring, all the cultivation sects in Chongling were closed. A youth dressed in red robes with a white fox collar floated over a high wall of a cultivation place in Chongling and snuck out. A light cough sounded not far away. This youth dressed in red robes with a white fox collar immediately froze. He did not have the terror that ordinary sect disciples would have when they were discovered escaping, but had a slightly embarrassed and angry expression. At this time, a soft voice sounded.
Cousin Anne is right.
You do not work hard on your cultivation usually. Hearing this, the youth's embarrassment and anger disappeared, and his face filled with joy. He suddenly turned around and said in disbelief to the person who had spoken, "Cousin, why have you come?" Standing nearby was a youth of similar age to him. Even though he had a teasing smile, he still appeared exceptionally kind and gentle. This was the imperial son Fu Su, who was the favorite of the Qin dynasty's empress and emperor. The Qin dynasty's empress Zheng Xiu only had one cousin, Zheng Fei, who had married into the Meng marquisate establishment. This youth dressed in red robes with a white fox collar called Fu Su cousin. He was naturally the heir of the Meng marquisate establishment, Meng Qihai. Looking at the overjoyed Meng Qihai, Fu Su was also happy. He smiled and said, "Mother Empress allowed me to travel outside and gain experience. I am not familiar with the outside world, so the first person I thought of was you. I heard that you are a top student of the Fish Sun Sword School who does not know your place and often jumps over the wall. I wanted to come to these high walls and imagine how you would look when you jumped over the wall. I had not expected you to jump in front of me like this." Meng Qihai did not have many chances to meet Fu Su in a year, but the two had played together since childhood. Fu Su was easygoing and often let him do as he wished. Even when children had conflicts, he would let him have his way. Therefore, he and Fu Su were very close. Usually, he would just call Fu Su cousin. In his joy, he jumped in front of Fu Su and grasped Fu Su's hands. He said, "Cousin, you came at the right time. I am the one who is thinking." Fu Su was slightly taken aback. "What do you mean?" Meng Qihai said happily, "Cousin, you cultivate the fastest of all the young talents in Chongling. It should not be a problem for you to deal with the people on the talent ranking. You came at the right time. Help me teach someone a lesson." Fu Su looked at him curiously and asked, "Teach who a lesson? What is going on?" "The White Goat Cave wine shop youth who was in the limelight a few days ago." Meng Qihai twisted his lips and said, "A few days ago, Jinting gone, and I heard extremely unfavorable news for him. Out of kindness, we went to find him. We thought that if he performed well, I would tell him the news." Unexpectedly, when Zhun Tingan challenged him, he refused to accept, and had his senior sect brother Zhang Yi accept the challenge. While even his senior sect brother Zhang Yi defeated Zhun Tingan, and it seems that the wine shop youth is stronger than his senior sect brother Zhang Yi, I do not like his attitude. Fu Su stilled and frowned slightly. He urged, "If there is any unfavorable news, just tell him directly. You have to challenge him first and see his performance. This is not the conduct of a gentleman." Meng Qihai looked helplessly at Fu Su and said, "I am not a gentleman. If he does not accept a fair challenge, that person does not even have any sense of shame, much less a gentleman. Cousin, you did not agree to help me, and now you scold me." Fu Su smiled slightly and did not respond to his words. He said softly, "I also want to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials." Meng Qihai was stunned and said, "How is this possible?" Fu Su smiled happily and said softly, "Mother Empress allows it." Meng Qihai finally refocused and trembled in excitement. "This is great. How can those people be a match for you?" Fu Su shook his head seriously. "That may not be the case. Cultivation and victory are not the same thing." Meng Qihai thought for a moment and said with a naughty smile, "Then you have to help me teach that wine shop youth a lesson. Compared to the people ranked at the top, cousin, you only lack experience in fighting. You are still thinking about this so-called venting matter." Fu Su looked warmly at him and said curiously, "I have paid attention to that wine shop youth. You said you heard extremely unfavorable news for him. What is it?" Meng Qihai said, I heard that the Li family wants to act against him. Fu Su frowned. The Li Marquisate establishment?
Why?
Meng Qihai shrugged and said, doesn't the Li Marquisate establishment have grievances with Sikong Lin of the Bureau of Ceremonies? Sikong Lin seems to have given this wine shop youth a great gift. The Li Marquisate establishment probably feels that Sikong Lin wants to support him in winning the Min Mountain Sword trials, so they want to act against him. Fu Su was very unhappy. He thought, no wonder Mother Empress always disliked the Li Marquisate establishment. Many times, the Li Marquisate establishment would fight for the slightest thing, and their claws were too vicious. Is this wine shop youth not innocent for being involved in such a grievance? Fu Su thought and asked, Min Mountain Sword sect will not let people interfere in the trials. Does the Li Marquisate establishment want to act against him before the Min Mountain Sword trials? Meng Qihai nodded. According to the news I heard, the Li Marquisate establishment has already sent Li Shixing back. Li Shixing is a wolf cub. When we were young, we did not like to play with him. I remember clearly that he broke 2 of Duanmu Jingzong's ribs over a minor matter, so the Li Marquisate establishment had no choice but to send him to the Yuezhi country. Meng Qihai sneered and said, he stayed in the Yuezhi country for so many years and ate so much sand. I think he does not have a good temper. Falling Parasol is not the Duanmu Marquisate establishment. If he wants to act, it will not be as simple as breaking 2 ribs. Fu Su's brow furrowed deeply. Back when Ding Ning reached profound understanding in half a day and had a breakthrough in a month, he had developed great curiosity about this wine shop youth. While he had heard the lessons of the Empress and his teachers, and knew that he should not spend time on these low-level cultivators, Ding Ning's performance after the Book of Talents was announced still attracted his attention. He had no thoughts about Ding Ning when he left the palace this time, but he had not expected to hear such a matter. This has nothing to do with the wine shop youth. Also, an outstanding cultivator like him is a valuable asset of the Qin dynasty. He unconsciously used the tone the Empress used to speak softly. Meng Qihai heard his meaning and twisted his lips. He said, Cousin, if you do not help me teach him a lesson, do you want to interfere in this matter and help him? Fu Su glanced at him and asked in response, if Li Shixing's personality has not changed after so many years, and he has become even worse after going to a chaotic place like the Yuezhi country, who do you hate more, compared to this wine shop youth? Meng Qihai stilled and said to himself, if we are comparing these two, of course it is Li Shixing. Fu Su looked at him and smiled slightly. Meng Qihai shouted in slight depression, Cousin, in terms of reasoning, I can't win against you. Fu Su smiled and then said seriously, if other people are present, remember not to call me cousin. Otherwise, other people may immediately discover my identity. I do not want to cause trouble. Meng Qihai immediately felt that this was a very important matter. He immediately nodded and said, I remember. Fu Su said with a smile, then you will take me to see that wine shop? Meng Qihai was impatient and immediately nodded. He said, all right, it will save Li Shixing from coincidentally going. Falling Parasol did not seem to be any different than usual. In the morning, when the families woke up to wash and eat breakfast, it was Falling Parasol's busiest time. After this time, Falling Parasol would quickly become quiet. There were few people on the streets and there were few customers in the ordinary shops. Business could barely keep up with life. Yet Zhang Sun Qianxue was the first to feel the abnormality. Thinking of the possibilities Ding Ning spoke of, her body quickly turned cold. However, when she sensed the cultivation of those people, she slowly relaxed. These people should not have come for the 9 King sword because the difference in power was too great. They could not keep her and Ding Ning here. She called out. When Ding Ning walked into the inner courtyard, she said coldly and told Ding Ning what she sensed. Many cultivators had appeared near Falling Parasol, and they were not cultivators strong enough to keep a Realm 7 cultivator here. Ding Ning's brow furrowed deeply. He could not think of a reason. When he walked out of the wine shop again and headed towards Shui Wangxu's little courtyard, the countless little silkworms in his body seemed to awaken from hibernation and silently moved. His perception immediately grew several times clearer. He sensed the positions of some of the cultivators. Then he quickly found that many cultivators were moving with two cultivators. The two cultivators heading towards falling parasol were at the center of the encirclement formed by the cultivators. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed slightly. He could vaguely see that there was a strange reflection in the eaves not far away. This was the cold reflection of metal smeared with large amounts of oil. This kind of reflection would only appear on some crossbows and crossbows. So, this was an assassination. Chapter 153. The sound of the carriage wheels rolling on the stone path sounded. Ding Ning's expression grew colder. In just a few breaths of time, he had already thought through many links. The people in this carriage could only have come to Falling Parasol because of him. But what was their identity that they would attract so many cultivators to assassinate them? Even more importantly, someone who could launch an assassination on such a scale would know that he, Zhang Yi, and the others were in this alley. Falling Parasol was in a remote area between the south and east of the city. The nearest turret would not be able to detect the activity here. If they wanted to assassinate the people in the carriage, they did not need to wait until they reached Falling Parasol. The more cultivators there were in an area, the more unknown factors there were. Therefore, there was only one possibility. The leader who planned this assassination must have taken him, Zhang Yi, and the others into consideration. Simply put, this person wanted to kill the people in the carriage, and them in Falling Parasol, in one go. Speed was important in war. Success and failure were often just a few minutes apart. In the eyes of everyone in Chongling, Ding Ning was just a low-level cultivator with some fame, but not enough wings. Yet he possessed unimaginable experience. Right now, without knowing who exactly was inside this carriage, he directly released a fierce shout with exceptional resolution. "There are assassins." At the same time he shouted, there was a rapid roar in the quiet air, as if someone had poured a bucket of water down from the second floor. Ding Ning's pupils contracted slightly. From this sound, he knew this was the long-wind armor-piercing crossbow. The long-wind armor-piercing crossbow was an imitation of the Chu dynasty's Chu-wind heavy crossbow. While the seal scripts on the crossbow were not as fine as the Chu dynasty's crossbow, and the bolts that could be used were 20% lighter than the Chu-wind heavy crossbow, they were slightly faster, and had enough penetrative power to break through the defenses of Realm 5 cultivators. This kind of armor-piercing crossbow was an important weapon in the Warden's treasury. In the armies that went on expeditions, every 100 soldiers were equipped with one. This kind of standard heavy weapon would be recorded in the records. To be able to appear in an assassination in the marketplace, it could only mean that the assassin was not an ordinary person. The person in the carriage right now was also not an ordinary person. The moment the extremely oppressive sound wave rang out, the cold metallic reflection finally revealed its true appearance. The roof of that area could not withstand the vibrations of the crossbow and directly shattered and collapsed. A heavy black crossbow slid down in the shadow of the roof. At the same time, a crossbow arrow that weighed over 50 kilograms and had 4 metal fins spun violently in the air. Like lightning, it struck the carriage that had just turned into the alley.
Clang!
The heavy crossbow bolt struck the carriage, but the scene of the carriage being easily torn apart like a piece of paper did not appear. The entire carriage gave off a muffled metallic sound. The wood on the surface splintered and sputtered, revealing a silver-white membrane inside. This layer of silvery white metal membrane looked extremely thin, which was why this carriage didn't look any different from an ordinary carriage. However, this thin layer of metal actually possessed astonishing toughness. This crossbow arrow that could even pierce through heavy armor actually couldn't penetrate it, only smashing against the surface. The powerful impact force forcibly sent the entire carriage flying outwards. With a boom, this carriage crashed into the wall of the noodle shop that Ding Ning and the others often ate at. Half of the wall collapsed, and it continued to slide inside, bringing with it countless bricks to crash into the smoking stove. Junior sect brother, what happened? Zhang Yi had just come out of the courtyard door behind Ding Ning. When he saw such a terrifying scene that he had never seen before, he immediately exclaimed in shock. An assassination. I'm afraid it includes us. You and junior sect brother Shen Yi protect cave master. Don't come out. Ding Ning knew that Zhang Yi was easily wishy-washy, so at the same time that he said these words as quickly as possible, he shouted, "Don't worry about me. I can handle it." Being shouted at by Ding Ning, Zhang Yi reflexively turned around and rushed back, almost colliding with Shen Yi who had rushed out. At this time, in the cold air that had yet to rest, another sharp howl sounded. Zhang Yi had become more and more convinced of Ding Ning during this period of time. Yet when he heard this sharp howl and turned his head to look, he gritted his teeth and shouted at Shen Yi, "Go hide, cave master." At the same time, he resolutely rushed back towards Ding Ning, because it was a light green sword light that let out that sharp howl. This light green sword light was still on the distant eaves a moment ago, but in the next moment, it was already above the alley. The sharp whistling sound from the distance was now like a thunderous roar. The chi of heaven and earth behind the sword light was dragged into a perfectly straight line, looking like wisps of white smoke in the air. This was undoubtedly a flying sword that only Realm 5 cultivators could use. Also, from the distance this sword flew, this cultivator had been immersed in flying sword arts for many years. He was not a cultivator who had just entered Realm 5, and his mental power was much stronger than ordinary people. Zhang Yi did not consider whether he was a match for this flying sword. He only sensed the killing intent of this flying sword coming towards Ding Ning. He thought that Ding Ning could not stop a flying sword like this. As a senior sect brother, he had to protect Ding Ning. Do not act rashly. Ding Ning could sense his intentions, but a hint of anger appeared on his face. Facing this flying sword, he only took half a step back. He pulled hard on Zhang Yi's sleeve and shouted, "Bam!" A clear sound. Right at this time, a streak of snow-white sword radiance directly rushed out from the collapsed noodle shop, directly blasting open a small hole in the roof of the noodle shop. While endless dust gushed out like a fountain, the snow-white sword radiance already caught up to that light green sword radiance. In the air, they exchanged more than 10 blows in an instant. There were no sparks, only more than 10 strange spheres of light erupting. The person in the carriage was also a Realm 5 cultivator. Zhang Yi's body went slightly rigid. However, before he could even take a breath, a loud boom sounded. All of the houses on the street began to tremble intensely. A blast of earth erupted across from the noodle shop, and the back courtyard of the tailor shop directly exploded. A tall and sturdy man whose entire body was radiating scarlet light seemed like a demonic general. He raised an enormous green axe that was even larger than his body and flew into the air with incomparable ferocity. The axe hacked towards the carriage that had sunk into the noodle shop. At this moment, the tall and sturdy man flew out amidst the flying dust. When his body reached the center of the alley, he swung his axe to the extreme. His entire body was bathed in the golden sunlight, and the green axe reflected the golden sun. It looked dazzling and powerful to the extreme. Zhang Yi, whose sleeve was being pulled by Ding Ning, stopped breathing and felt cold all over. The person in the carriage had a flying sword outside and could not come back in time. Although the metal compartment of the carriage was tough, it was impossible for it to withstand the axe. It was about to be flattened.
Who are you?
Do you not know death? However, at this moment, a calm and cold voice resounded. The carriage driver who had been sitting at the front of the carriage, who even Ding Ning had not sensed any presence of a cultivator when the two horses were thrown out together, appeared in front of the carriage. This 40-something-year-old carriage driver, dressed in old robes, had previously looked haggard and strange, shivering in fear of the cold. But at this time, his body was flowing with a strange light, and the primal energies of a universe under his feet even formed a pure white cloud. Facing the hatchet-wielding cultivator, who leapt over, his aura indescribably ferocious, he only sent out a fist. He punched out, and a straight line appeared in front of his fist. The compressed air shot forward, forming a sword of strong wind. However, what was even more terrifying was the invisible power behind the strong wind. This punch was a sword. You are Chiu in the air, The large cultivator who had swung his axe down suddenly paled and shouted in shock when he saw this punch. But it was too late to change anything.
Clang.
There was a muffled sound. The straight and invisible greatsword collided with the great axe in his hand, and the great axe in his hand was instantly sent flying backwards. The violent vibrations and impact from the handle of the great axe directly rushed into his body through his arm, and in an instant, his heart and lungs were shaken and injured. A blast of bloody mist erupted from this tall and sturdy cultivator's mouth. As the giant axe in his hand flew out, his body also flew out, falling into the smoke and dust he had just charged out of. Vacuum-killing sword, Qiu Zixing. Third year of Yuanwu, a disciple of Lingxiu, sword gate. At this time, the two flying swords were still entangled above the eaves, countless streaks of sword light flickering endlessly. It looked extremely beautiful, but it contained endless danger. Before the tall and sturdy cultivator's body landed on the ground, there were already sounds of praise that sounded from the entrance the carriage came from. A yellow-robed youth who looked like a weak scholar slowly walked over, holding a paper fan. Qiu Zixing, Zhang Yi swallowed. His mouth tasted bitter. He had never heard of Qiu Zixing's name, but a disciple of Lingxiu's sword gate, who could be described as having left the mountain, was a true direct disciple who had passed the Lingxiu sword gate exam. This kind of direct disciple was fundamentally different from the cultivators who had been recommended and entered the sect through other means. Each year, Lingxiu sword gate would only send a dozen or so direct disciples. Even without that terrifying punch just now, Zhang Yi knew how powerful a cultivator with such status would be. Yet, a direct disciple of Lingxiu's sword gate seemed to be the guard of the person in the carriage. Then what kind of noble existence was inside the carriage? He could not imagine. At that moment, Qiu Zixing's expression was calm when he heard the yellow-robed youth's name. He looked at the yellow-robed youth with a sympathetic tone and said, "Do you think you can escape after attacking here?" Chapter 154. This was not a threat, but a pure statement of fact. Unless it was a cultivator above Realm 7, or an assassin who could escape with one strike, any Realm 5 or 6 cultivator who lingered here could not leave Chongling. While Chongling did not have walls, it was more terrifying than almost any city with walls. However, the yellow-robed young man did not show any fear or anxiety. Instead, he was calm and satisfied. He glanced at the distant turret and sky and said, "We have never thought about escaping from here. We only need a period of time for us to complete our mission. I think you should understand now that the reason why we are all at this level of cultivation is so that we won't attract the attention of the spectators on the turret so quickly." Qiu Zixing frowned slightly and instinctively said, "Death warriors." A hint of a smile even appeared on the yellow-robed youth's face. He said slowly, "It is worth it to use our lives to exchange for the lives of these young people." His smile was sincere, but in reality, it was cruel and tragic. Qiu Zixing's eyebrows slowly rose, and he said coldly, "Any death warrior is a sacrifice of a scheme. I just want to know why you are deliberately delaying for time." At this time, the two flying swords were still entangled on the eaves. The sword energy had torn apart countless roof tiles. The yellow-robed youth spoke calmly and was delaying for time. The yellow-robed youth still smiled slightly and said, "I am delaying for time, waiting for this moment." As he said this, he opened the paper fan in his hand. The paper fan opened, but it wasn't a fan with exquisite patterns drawn on it. Instead, more than 10 yellow talisman papers flew out. At the same time, all the power accumulated in the yellow-robed youth's body erupted and poured into the dozen seal papers. Because the eruption was so intense, countless drops of essence blood seeped out of the yellow-robed youth's skin and spread in the air like peach blossoms. Other than the fervent light in his eyes, the yellow-robed youth's body withered like a flower and lost its vitality. Qiu Zixing suddenly changed expression and shouted, "Seal Master!" Zhang Yi's eyes widened in disbelief. There were almost no cultivators in Chongling skilled in the seal path. Just the material of the talisman paper and the concoction of the talisman ink were like the refinement of pills. They had to go through countless procedures, and the talisman markings on the talisman paper was an extremely profound knowledge. Only the Great Yuan dynasty, which was the furthest away from the Qin dynasty and was rich in silver candlegrass, black dragon toad, and many other materials suitable for making talisman paper and talisman ink, had naturally formed many sects that cultivated and fought using talismans. It seemed that only the cultivators of some of the powerful sects of the Yuan dynasty could do such a thing. As Qiu Zixing shouted, the dozens of seal papers disappeared and turned into turbulent primal energies of the universe. Countless tiny tornadoes suddenly rose from the ground beneath him. They were like countless transparent ropes that tightly bound his body. The terrifying power continued to seep into his body. Qiu Zixing's face instantly turned blood red. A metallic sound rang out from his body. His entire body exuded a biting cold sword intent, as if he had turned into a huge sword. However, his expression changed again. The power released by this yellow-robed youth was so fierce that he could not break free. Almost subconsciously, his spiritual sense swept behind him. A gray-black flying sword floated out of the shadows behind him like a ghost. The reason why it was said to be floating out was because this flying sword, which looked like a mosquito's leg, did not carry any smoke or fire. Not only did it not emit any yuan qi or sword qi, it did not even emit any sound of the wind. Even though it appeared in Qiu Zixing's perception, he could not sense where this flying sword had come from, or where the owner of this flying sword was. Any flying sword would be guided by mental power and primal energies of the universe. They were like puppets controlled by strings, but this flying sword was like a puppet that had been disconnected from its strings and was still moving freely. The yellow-robed youth was waiting for this flying sword to come close to him. The power of these talismans was only to immobilize him and prevent him from dodging the flying sword. His power far surpassed everyone present. With him blocking the front of the carriage, even if there were a few more flying swords on the eaves, they could not truly threaten the people inside the carriage. However, these death warriors clearly did not only learn of his identity after he made his move. These death soldiers clearly had an accurate estimate of his power and had planned such an attack from the start. At this time, there should have been at least 2 flying swords that could save him, but not one had appeared. This could only mean that the 2 powerful existences who were secretly protecting this carriage like him had already been dealt with by someone else. Qiu Zixing's heart was so cold, it was indescribable. Not because he was about to face death, but because he could not imagine what kind of uproar the people in the carriage would cause if they tried to assassinate him here. Without a flying sword, he could not keep up with the speed of the flying sword. The flying sword on the eaves had sensed Qiu Zixing's danger, but it was pressed down by the flying sword that had become even fiercer and could not be pulled back. Seeing the gray-black flying sword fly towards Qiu Zixing's back, Qiu Zixing could not escape the fate of being stabbed through the chest. But at this time, Ding Ning let go of Zhang Yi's sleeve and took a step to the left. He raised his left hand. With a hiss, a black sword light shot out of his fingertip, turning into a black meteor at astounding speed, and hit the gray-black flying sword. With a faint shattering sound, the black sword light shattered into several dozen pieces. That grayish-black flying sword that had been silently drifting through the air was also forcefully sent flying more than 100 feet away. It even pierced through the wall of the noodle shop's backyard and flew out. Dozens of black pieces hit Qiu Zixing's back. The cold energy seeped into his body like countless ice needles, and the hair behind his head was covered in strange blue frost. His body became even colder, but a glimmer of hope suddenly appeared in his eyes. With a clang, he channeled his vital energy even more fiercely to fight against the invisible ropes binding him. The yellow-robed youth looked in disbelief at Ding Ning, who had attacked. He was unusually shocked and furious, and vomited blood again. Faint cries of surprise could be heard from the distant streets and alleys. Everyone who participated in this assassination was shaken to the core. No one had expected Ding Ning to be able to stop such a fatal blow. Ding Ning did not feel any joy at having temporarily resolved Qiu Zixing's fatal situation with one blow. This was clearly a flying sword from the Qi dynasty's Fly Pond. Even though he could sense the location of some cultivators, he could not sense where the cultivator was hiding. If they couldn't kill this cultivator, then this type of soundless flying sword was still a fatal threat to everyone in this alley. At this time, he could not sense the cultivator's location and could only force him to attack even more fiercely. Only by concentrating more power on the flying sword could he sense the cultivator's location. Senior sect brother, kill that seal master, Ding Ning shouted. He gripped the last flower remnant sword in his hand and flashed towards Qiu Zixing. There was a tearing sound. It was like someone had suddenly torn apart a brocade robe. Another flying sword tore through the air in the murderous, cold air. A thin silver flying sword furiously fell from a distant building towards Ding Ning's head. Seeing another flying sword, Zhang Yi, who was already pale, did not dare to hesitate. In addition, Ding Ning's shout carried a mournful tone that did not allow him to refuse. As he flew forward, he shouted and stabbed the sword in his hand into the sky. Moisture filled the entire alley. Countless lines of crystal rain appeared in the sky above falling parasol and fell down like small swords. At the same time, the thin silver-white flying sword was close to Ding Ning's body. There was a suppressed gasp in the carriage. The thin flying sword that was falling like an arrow suddenly changed direction and inconceivably flew horizontally. It landed behind Ding Ning and sped up again. Ding Ning attacked. The last flower remnant sword in his hand swung backwards. A white sword light rose up like a white goat's horn. With a pop, the thickest part of the white goat's horn coincidentally stopped this flying sword. The flying sword cut through, cutting through the horn-like sword energy, and continued to slash towards Ding Ning's body. Yet Ding Ning's last flower sword did not stop moving. The remnant sword's tip accurately hit the flying sword. With a shout, this flying sword that had lost much of its power and had not been able to channel more power into it was pushed over Ding Ning's head. Countless lines of rain fell on the yellow-robed youth. The yellow-robed youth had used up all of his vital energy and was powerless to stop it. Pew 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 pew, his clothing was torn, and his body was covered in tiny bloody holes. He could no longer stand and fell to the ground like a pile of rotten flesh. Such a scene appearing at the same time was a shocking and unexpected performance of the two youths from Falling Parasol. Qiu Zixing almost shouted in joy. Yet at this time, a strange color silently floated out of the ditch under the eaves next to Ding Ning. It was that gray-black flying sword. Ding Ning had just used all his strength to block the attack of another flying sword, and now this flying sword was here. How could he block it? Seeing this wine shop youth who had just saved him was about to die, Qiu Zixing's joyful shout immediately turned into a furious roar. His body began to tremble violently in an instant. Countless layers of power collided like a sword and a scabbard were rubbing against each other. Blood dripped out of his mouth and nose. Yet this invisible energy rope that the yellow-robed youth had created at the cost of his life was extremely strong. Even so, it only gave off faint cracking sounds and did not immediately collapse. At this time, Ding Ning's eyes were unusually calm. The remnant sword in his right hand was still moving upwards, but his left hand was pointing at the gray-black flying sword.
Pew.
Following that, there was another desolate shattering sound. The small cold sword that flew out from his fingertips once again struck the flying sword and sent it flying once more. Chapter 155. The small silver sword that Ding Ning had flicked over his head gave off a loud hiss, representing its master's anger. The sword of a Realm 5 cultivator had been stopped by a youth like this. Also, this youth had not died even after being attacked by another flying sword. For the master of this flying sword, this was a great humiliation. Yet, when cultivators fought, life and death were just a hair's breadth away. As the small silver sword gave off a loud hiss in the air, drawing a beautiful arc in the air and falling towards Ding Ning like a meteor, countless explosions sounded around Qiu Zixing. The dozen invisible ropes that the yellow-robed youth had used as life, as the price finally broke apart. Pieces of the invisible rope fell to the ground around Qiu Zixing like heavy iron chains. Every piece of the rope fell to the ground, creating a huge wave of air. Around Qiu Zixing's body, it was as if waves were blooming. Once he lost the bindings of these energy ropes, the power in his body was finally freed. Qiu Zixing's gaze landed on the small silver sword flying towards Ding Ning. His hands slapped towards the depths of the noodle shop behind him. The two unparalleled sword qis intersected, forming a complete transparent sword that pierced out with extreme determination. In the next moment, the backyard of the noodle shop exploded like a sheepskin raft that had been filled with too much air. Countless fragments flew backwards. Then, the many courtyards and walls behind the noodle shop were pierced through by this large sword. Waves of dust bloomed, forming a straight path that pointed towards a middle-aged cultivator standing in front of a well in a small courtyard. The middle-aged cultivator's anger immediately turned to terror. He knew he could not react in time and could only close his eyes in despair. Crack! The bones in his chest and abdomen were all shattered. His entire body was almost split in two by this sword. His body fell backwards and fell into the well behind him. This cultivator's silver-white flying sword was less than 10 feet from Ding Ning. But the thin silver-white small sword lost control at this time, flying over Ding Ning's head and falling into the ditch by the road. Qiu Zixing did not care about the flying sword flying toward Ding Ning. Instead, he killed the owner of the flying sword with one strike, completely solving the problem. However, there was no joy in Ding Ning's eyes. At this moment, the outcome of the battle between the two flying swords on the eaves had already been decided. In the end, the snow-white flying sword that flew out of the carriage was far inferior to the light green flying sword in terms of strength. Finally, it was unable to continue and was sent flying by the sword, bouncing towards a distant roof. The light green flying sword danced in the air happily, circling around the half-collapsed noodle shop, waiting for an opportunity. This light green flying sword and the grayish-black flying sword that had quietly disappeared at this moment, there were still two flying swords that were enough to kill. The light green flying sword danced around the carriage. The person in the carriage had lost his flying sword, and Qiu Zixing presumably did not dare to leave the carriage. Before Qiu Zixing took care of the light green flying sword, he still had to face the flying sword that had obtained the fly pond sword art of the Qi dynasty. Feeling that there were still 22 pieces of crystal made from star fiendish energy in his body, Ding Ning felt lucky. If he had not obtained such a method from the Zhou family ink garden, Zhongsun Qianxue would have been forced to act today. Then, he and Zhongsun Qianxue would have had to flee Chongling. However, he could only send out 22 more of these small cold fiendish swords. He did not have any confidence in being able to last until Qiu Zixing dealt with the flying sword or until reinforcements arrived. The Fly Pond was one of the strangest cultivation places of the Qi dynasty. It was an ancient burial mound with a yin spring. It was a place where yin energy gathered. There were countless flies called ghost flies flying outside the sect. Any inner sect disciple who wanted to leave the sect had to kill the flies with a sword so that not a single fly would land on them before they were allowed to leave the mountain. The traceless ghost sword was one of the most important skills of the Fly Pond. It took countless years of hard work to cultivate to such a level. Regardless of the reason this cultivator had appeared in this assassination, he had to be a true inner sect disciple of the Fly Pond. A cultivator who came from a cultivation place like this naturally had more than what he had shown so far. From the start, the yellow-robed youth had used his life to trap Qiu Zixing. This Fly Pond cultivator was the true core of this assassination. A fallen leaf flipped up next to Ding Ning. That grayish-black little sword had silently snuck under the fallen leaf next to Ding Ning. Careful. Just now, Qiu Zixing's attack had used up large amounts of vital energy, but his fighting spirit was at its strongest. In this moment, he also sensed the slight movement next to Ding Ning and immediately gave a shout. But when he gave the warning, he knew that if Ding Ning had not sensed anything unusual before, it was too late now. Ding Ning had not detected this grayish-black little sword earlier, but when the fallen leaf flipped up, he had sensed the existence of this little sword. Sensing the coldness, his eyebrows rose slightly. His left hand hanging outside his sleeve moved slightly again. There was a hiss. This sound would sound in anyone's ears, but in reality, it was because the interval was so short that it exceeded the limits of the human ear. He had 2 fewer fiendish energy crystals in his meridian points. 2 black sword lights charged out of Ding Ning's fingertips. Almost at the same time, they accurately hit the grayish-black flying sword that had just floated up from the ground. With a muffled sound, the little sword that had been raised like a poisonous snake hiding in the dried leaves fell to the ground, leaving behind multiple marks on the stone ground. Zhang Yi's eyes widened. He was pleasantly surprised, but his body quickly sank into coldness. This grayish-black little sword shot up violently towards Ding Ning again. As more power bloomed, black energy shrouded the grayish-black little sword like countless little ghosts were about to surge out. Using this opportunity, Ding Ning finally sensed the extremely weak path in the air and sensed the true location of this cultivator from the fly pond. The cultivator from the fly pond turned out to be a beggar who was huddling under a shabby house 2 blocks away. At such a distance, Ding Ning was certain that even if Qiu Zixing discovered his existence, he would not be able to kill him in a short time. As for himself, he could not pass through 2 streets to reach the other. The chill in his heart grew stronger, but his emotions were still extremely calm. 3 streaks of black sword light shot out from the fingertips of his left hand, one after another, accurately striking the small grayish-black sword. The grayish-black little sword defeated 2 of his sword lights. When it defeated the 3rd sword light, it finally slowed down. Ding Ning's last flower longsword in his right hand swung out and hit the grayish-black little sword hard. This grayish-black little sword was once again thrown out and bounced away. A thunderous roar rang out at this moment. Qiu Zixing's hands moved together again, but unlike before, his hands swept rapidly through the air. Dozens of crisscrossing lights lit up. These lights did not seem like sword lights, but blade lights. His arms were like blades, guiding the primal energies of the universe as they crisscrossed in the air. The light green flying sword didn't expect him to have such a method, and was forced into a narrow space by the violent saber light. With a bang, a saber light finally caught the sword's trace and viciously chopped down on the light green small sword. A loud muffled grunt came from the distant alley. The light green little sword struggled out of the blade net. This attack had clearly caused great damage to the master of the little sword. But the master of the little sword knew the present situation and still managed to hold on. After the light green little sword retreated more than 100 feet, it started to speed up again and formed countless twisted sword shadows in the air. In a small courtyard not far from Ding Ning and Zhang Yi, Shui Wangxi was sitting on a rattan chair in the bedroom. Since the battle started, he had only frowned and silently hid in this dimly lit room. At this time, Shunyi closed the door and stood nervously next to him. Hearing the sounds of each attack outside and sensing Ding Ning's performance, his expression grew more nervous, but his eyes grew brighter. 5 feet behind you, slash. At this time, he suddenly shouted at Shunyi. Shunyi's mind was tense to its limit, his hands covered in fine sweat. He did not feel anything, but Shui Wangxi's shout contained an irresistible command. He instinctively turned and attacked. There was a loud explosion. A bolt of lightning landed 5 feet behind him. There was a window 5 feet behind him. Just as the lightning from his sword landed, a grayish-black light came through the crack in the window. The grayish-black little sword that Ding Ning had just blocked was silently sneaking over. There was a hiss. The grayish-black little sword froze and was burned by the lightning. Wisps of blue smoke rose from the blade, and the blade seemed to twist in pain. However, Chunyi's breathing had completely stopped. Even he could feel that this sword strike was accumulating momentum and was about to burst out again. Shui Wangxu shouted. His breathing was irregular, and he was about to cough. But he forced himself to endure. His face was red as he shouted again, painting remnant scroll sword essence, slash. Shunyi's vital energy almost instinctively surged out of his body with a shout. The runes on the long sword in his hands suddenly surged with endless black light, as if a giant ink ball was going to devour the entire room. However, in front of his sword tip, countless pure and dazzling threads of light suddenly shot out. A bright beam of light hit the grayish-black little sword. The entire room seemed to contain a pure sun and lit up. Pure and blinding light came out of all the cracks. Chapter 156. Ding Ning suddenly turned around. He once again confirmed the thoughts of this fly pond cultivator. The target of this fly pond cultivator was all the young people on this street. In a situation where it was difficult to kill him in a short time, this fly pond cultivator did not have any obsession, but wanted to instantly kill Chini, who was the easiest to kill in his eyes. But this fly pond cultivator ignored Shui Wangxi's existence. He ignored the fact that even though Shui Wangxi was weaker than an ordinary old person, he was a great cultivator above Realm 7. The gray-black sword at this time was a silent assassination sword intent, so it didn't carry much power, so when it was hit by Chun-Yi's sword, it was immediately sent flying out of the window. The grayish-black blade was particularly eye-catching in the pure, dazzling light. These dazzling and pure rays of light seemed to have a natural suppressive effect on the energy flowing on the small gray-black sword. At this time, the small gray-black sword sizzled like black oil was melting, and wisps of green smoke were constantly coming out of it. From the start, Ding Ning felt that these death soldiers would not spare any cultivator in this alley, other than Zhongsun Qianxue, whom they did not know. So he did not conceal his strength at all, and played an important role at the crucial moment to attract the attention of these cultivators. But this fly pond cultivator's cultivation and intelligence far exceeded his expectations, and still did things beyond his control. Assassins always had more initiative than those who defended passively. But this fly pond cultivator miscalculated again, giving him a chance to completely turn the situation around. He suddenly turned around, and a black light seeped out of the fingertips of his left hand. Everyone thought that he would attack the grayish-black sword that was particularly conspicuous in the bright light. Even the grayish-black flying sword had a trace of fear, and as if it had a life of its own, it once again pulled itself together and flashed upwards. However, what everyone did not expect was that after a series of sounds that made one's scalp turn numb, one after another, black-colored sword light shot out with a flip of his hand. All of them shot toward the small light green sword that had countless shadows lingering around it. The light green sword only wanted to trap Qiu Zixing to the side of the carriage. The sword shadows flickered. Even Qiu Zixing could not accurately grasp which sword shadow the true sword was in, and did not dare to attack. At this time, Ding Ning's back was facing the light green sword, and he could not accurately hit it. However, the dozen or so black sword lights that were shot out in succession were shockingly cold. They pierced through countless light green afterimages and immediately forced out the true body of the light green sword. Qiu Zixing's eyes seemed to burn. The cultivator in the distance screamed, sensing the greatest danger. The light green small sword trembled so much it seemed like it was about to explode. But it was too late. Qiu Zixing's fists punched again. The too terrifying translucent sword Qi fused into a large sword once more. It instantly pierced out over 30 meters and heavily struck the light green sword. The light green sword seemed to wail in despair. It immediately lost power and spun out like a piece of scrap metal, falling to an unknown place. The small grayish-black sword that had been deceived became enraged. The black qi on the sword wildly surged and actually formed dozens of black fly-like objects around the sword. They also descended in a straight line towards Ding Ning. Ding Ning's expression grew grave. A sword seal formed in front of him. A large river faced the gray-black sword. The power of his sword was far from the power that the fly pond cultivator had displayed. The river was directly penetrated. However, he was only fighting for a moment to slow down the speed of this small gray-black sword that was already flowing with an aura of despair. This was to ensure that his next cold small sword could hit its target. There was a soft hiss. Blood seeped out of his fingertips. The crystal-like cold energy formed a small black sword and accurately hit the tip of the gray-black sword. The small black sword immediately shattered into countless black pieces, spreading into layers of cold, fiendish energy. The extremely gloomy grayish-black sword was like a small boat in a torrent, but it was suddenly hit by a head-on wave and paused in midair. With this pause, the remaining 5 cold swords in Ding Ning's body shot out and hit the gray-black flying sword one after another. The body of the flying sword was slightly bent unwillingly and was pushed back a few feet by the impact. Ding Ning took a deep breath. He had used up all his power and could not stop any of the gray-black flying sword's attacks. Now, he could only rely on Qiu Zixing. When the gray-black flying sword had turned violent, Qiu Zixing's eyes were filled with nervousness and worry. But when Ding Ning's first cold sword hit the gray-black flying sword, his body relaxed. He knew the situation was set. The more relaxed he was, the more his vital energy flowed. The comfort he felt could not be described with words. He laughed wildly. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the carriage. The ground under his feet exploded. He pulled the carriage with one hand and flew into the air, landing in the middle of the street. The wild wind blew, and half of the noodle shop collapsed behind him. The gray-black flying sword paused slightly in the air and did not fly towards anyone. 2 streets away, the owner of the grayish-black flying sword, a man in ragged clothes who looked like a beggar, shook his head and flew up. With just 2 leaps, he crossed 2 streets and appeared in front of the collapsed noodle shop. This was a man in his 40s. His face was covered in black oil, and his features were ordinary. He did not leave any impression. But at this time, his hands were flowing with energy like black flames. He looked at Ding Ning with a bitter gaze and sighed emotionally. "How can you be so calm?" Before anyone could say anything, a crashing sound was heard as the courtyard wall of a shop was smashed down by someone. A long-bearded cultivator in indigo robes struggled out of the hole. He held an empty, white jade scabbard in his hand. He looked to be in his 30s and had an elegant bearing. However, right now, beads of blood continuously seeped out from his skin. When he just walked out from the hole in the courtyard wall, his clothes still looked clean, but after just 3 steps, his green clothes were already soaked in blood, turning into a blood-red robe. What kind of sword art is that? This cultivator blinked to stop the blood from falling into his eyes, so he could see Ding Ning's face clearly. This cultivator was the owner of the light green sword. He had fought with Qiu Zixing for a long time, without regard for his injuries. Adding on that Qiu Zixing had destroyed his flying sword with his last attack, his wounds were grave. At this time, everyone could sense that he had forced himself to appear here because he wanted to see Ding Ning before he died. Even sword attendants who have been trained for a long time and specialize in cutting flying swords cannot be as accurate as you. I originally thought that we could rewrite the history books, but I had miscalculated you. This cultivator looked regretfully and with a hint of admiration at Ding Ning. After saying this, he could no longer support himself and fell to the ground. The scene sank into silence. Everyone could understand his and the fly pond cultivator's emotions right now. Even if other people had the same star fiendish energy method as Ding Ning and could create black sword lights like that, who could be so calm in such a situation when facing the pressure of the flying sword? If there was a hint of panic and emotion if the attack missed, the entire battle situation could be changed. But Ding Ning had not made a mistake. This was what shocked him and the fly pond cultivator the most. Chongling really is the place where true dragons are born. Generation after generation, there are many stunning children. I just wanted to eliminate a few of them, but I still underestimated them. The beggar-like fly pond cultivator sighed deeply. It is about time. He sensed the presence in the surrounding air and bowed to Qiu Zixing. He said, "This last attack, I want to see Mr. Qiu's Lingxiu sword gates peerless sword." Qiu Zixing understood the fly pond cultivator's meaning. His expression grew solemn. In the next moment, his vital energy surged out of his body, but primal energies of the universe surged in and gathered in his right hand. His right hand had turned bronze. The qi and blood in his body seemed to be burning, and every inch of his flesh and blood was bursting with terrifying power. With just one step, he came in front of the fly pond cultivator. His right hand was a sword and stabbed at the other's chest. This fly pond cultivator sensed a fierce sword essence he had never encountered before. A hint of gratefulness flashed through his eyes. The gray-black sword landed in his hand. As the sword swung upwards, black energy condensed into particles that flew out like a fountain and smashed into Qiu Zixing's body. In the next moment, the black spring in front of him was completely destroyed by Qiu Zixing's sword. This fly pond cultivator's body exploded like a ripe watermelon, spraying out waves of blood in the streets. Zhang Yi had an unbearable expression and felt like vomiting. Ding Ning did not like the smell of blood and held his breath. But he knew that dying with dignity in battle was the best outcome for this fly pond cultivator. Qiu Zixing pulled back his hand. Waves of great exhaustion started to sweep through his body. He took a deep breath. He knew he could not defeat any Realm 5 cultivator. He turned around and saw the indigo-robed cultivator on the ground had died with his head bowed. The blood dripping out of his nose and mouth had clearly turned black due to the poison he had taken. Sensing the flowing presences, he knew this place was absolutely safe. But what he found unusual was that, theoretically, there should be Realm 7 cultivators arriving by now. Chongling was a square, and the streets were divided like tofu. While outsiders might not know, he knew that the two high ministers would make arrangements to ensure that there was a Realm 7 cultivator in charge of many of the squares. Even when Bai Shanshui had been fighting and singing that day, Yi Xiling had been just a step away from arriving. But today, there was such an important person in the carriage, someone who could change the course of history. Also, the battle had been fierce for a long time. Why had no Realm 7 cultivators appeared on this side? Chapter 157. But he did not need to worry about the matters of those important people. Qiu Zixing asked the people in the carriage in a soft voice, and then turned to look at Ding Ning. In today's assassination, the enemy had sent out a powerful seal master, 3 skilled swordsmen, and even a cultivator from the fly pond. In the end, the 3 youths from White Goat Cave would decide the result, especially Ding Ning's performance. If not for Ding Ning's incredible performance, he would have been killed immediately like his colleagues who had not appeared. When the Realm 7 cultivators arrived, the result would have been decided. Your performance today can only be described as perfect. Anyone who is your teacher will feel proud of you. Qiu Zixing said solemnly to Ding Ning, and then bowed towards the little courtyard where Shui Wangxi was. He was a cultivator who had left the Lingxiu Sword Gate in the 3rd year of Yuanwu. In terms of status and experience, he was an elder to Ding Ning. So, he gave such an evaluation of Ding Ning in his first sentence. His following words were to express the most sincere respect to White Goat Cave and Shui Wangxiu, who could teach such a disciple. I owe you my life. Then he said seriously to Ding Ning in a soft voice. This was his personal gratitude, and it was completely from his personal standpoint. You do not owe me. Ding Ning looked calmly at Qiu Zixing and the numerous cultivators in casual clothing who had entered the alley. These cultivators were definitely stronger than the people of the Astrology Bureau and Divinity Bureau. Also, they did not come close to Qiu Zixing and the carriage. From this, he could guess the identities of the people in the carriage. While I do not know what is going on with these people, they clearly want to kill us. Ding Ning shook his head and continued, if it weren't for an expert like you, we would all have died here. Qiu Zixing smiled slightly and did not argue with Ding Ning. He only said, maybe I can recommend you to enter the Lingxiu Sword Gate to study. Hearing this, Zhang Yi and Shan Yi shook. But Ding Ning shook his head again and said, I have decided to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials. Qiu Zixing stilled slightly, but then smiled and nodded approvingly. Cultivation must first follow your heart. Since Min Mountain Sword Sect is your first choice, entering Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate will be beneficial to your future cultivation. After a pause, he shook his head and said, I thought too much. With your performance today, I think you will win in Min Mountain Sword Sect in the future. Ding Ning thought for a moment. He looked at the flowing cultivators and said softly, if you really want to help me, do not let the details of today's battle spread. Qiu Zixing was not surprised. He had not expected Ding Ning to have so many deeper thoughts. He only thought that Ding Ning's method of condensing fiendish energy into a sword was astounding, but it was straightforward and lacked many variations compared to a flying sword. If he faced true experts and this method was known beforehand, he would be at a disadvantage. I understand. Qiu Zixing nodded seriously and said, I will do my best. As Qiu Zixing and Ding Ning were talking softly, two youths in the carriage were also talking softly. These two youths were Fu Su and Meng Qihai. One was the imperial son of the Qin dynasty who would become crown prince next year if nothing unexpected happened, and the other was the heir of the Meng marquisate establishment. Regardless of which one of them died, the entire dynasty would be in great waves, much less both of them being assassinated here. At this time, Fu Su's face was slightly pale, and his breathing was unstable. But his eyes were full of praise and excitement. Meng Qihai's forehead was slightly damp with cold sweat. His face was even paler than Fu Su. Qihai, what do you think of Ding Ning right now? Thinking back to the many scenes of the battle just now, Fu Su smiled warmly as he looked at Meng Qihai, who was still in shock. Meng Qihai took a deep breath and said softly, I had not expected him to be so strong. Fu Su smiled and said, Then, do you still feel unconvinced and feel that his pretentious attitude is annoying? His performance today is something even two of me cannot compare to. Of course, I am convinced. Meng Qihai lowered his head in shame. But then he immediately looked up and said, Why don't we go out and give our thanks now? Fu Su shook his head warmly and said, Another day is better. Meng Qihai was puzzled and asked, Why? If we go out now, there will be so many people. It will be troublesome. Fu Su looked at him and said softly, Also, the difference in status between us and him is too great. I do not want them to feel that we are too high above when we start to interact. Meng Qihai heard the deeper meaning in Fu Su's words. His eyes lit up. You mean we should conceal our identities and interact with them? Fu Su sighed softly and frowned. I do not know why something like this happened today. I do not know if something like this will cause Mother Empress and Father King to change their minds. But even if they allow me to attend the Min Mountain Sword trials, even if I do not wanna, I fear that my whereabouts and identity will be hidden even more. Dressed in white robes, Yi Sealing sat in a carriage and waited. Theoretically, she was the Realm 7 cultivator who should have appeared near Falling Parasol. However, not far from the carriage she was in, there were layers upon layers of canopies that stretched endlessly. Surprisingly, it was the fish market. Fish market was open for business, but today, it was even quieter and more deathly silent than the days of the New Year. Many of the shops were still open, but it was not just the people. Even the ghosts seemed to have disappeared. The originally narrow and crowded dirt path seemed to have become a little more spacious. A person dressed in a white fox fur robe, with a handsome appearance like a young master of a wealthy family, strolled through the alleys of Fish Market. With him as the center, there seemed to be countless whispers that sounded like ghosts. However, as he moved forward, these voices quickly disappeared in fear.
He did not go too deep.
After 100 steps, he seemed to be tired of the same scenery. He stopped and said with slight disdain, I do not know if these canopies are used to hide the ghost energy, or to hide the presence of Realm 7. But do I really have to tear them down before you are willing to come out? Mr. Bai, you are a true dragon of the river. This is just a small quagmire. I do not know what has angered Mr. Bai. Mr. Bai is not riding the waves in the river, but tearing down this quagmire that can barely fit you. An old voice sounded in the darkness. A stooped old man holding a black bamboo staff slowly walked out of the shadows of a narrow alley. This should not be something you are asking me, but something I should be asking you. Bai Shanshui looked at the black bamboo staff in the stooped old man's hand. In his perception, there were many black bamboos swaying in the surroundings. His jade-like face showed great disdain. I have come to Chongling more than a dozen times, but have never entered Fish Market before. The reason is because we all have our own paths and do not cross each other's paths. However, you've gone too far. He paused slightly and looked coldly at the hunchbacked old man. While Fanjwa treated me like the sect master, he was my senior sect brother. It is one thing for you to kill my senior sect brother, but you stole something from my cloud water palace. Do you really think I am dead? The stooped old man's expression froze slightly. He said solemnly, Mr. Bai, you must have misunderstood. Apologies. Bai Shanshui looked at the old man and said. The stooped old man stilled and did not understand his meaning. A person like Bai Shanshui, who could summon the clouds and reign like a dragon king, was no small matter. He would not feel that something was wrong because of his words. Apologies, Bai Shanshui repeated. Then he looked coolly at him and said, If I have misunderstood, why don't you tell me? Of all the cultivation sects and places in Chongling, other than the master of Fish Market, who else in Chongling knows the secret arts of the Qi Ghost Bamboo sect, and which cultivator who knows this secret art has reached Realm 7? The stooped old man completely understood his meaning. I do not know who else in Chongling is like this. In reality, if we knew that Chongling suddenly had a cultivator like this, we would be shocked ourselves. The stooped old man looked up at Bai Shanshui and said seriously, but we do not know that your senior sect brother was killed by someone, much less that he died at the hands of a Realm 7 cultivator who cultivates the ghost bamboo in secret art. We really did not do this. Bai Shanshui shook his head and said, I did not come here today to listen to such powerless explanations. If you can say that there is such a cultivator in Chongling, I may believe you. Pity. There is no other place in Chongling that has such a cultivator. After a pause, he said with slight disdain, Only the former Shang family in Chongling is the traitorous disciple of the Qi dynasty's ghost bamboo sect. The stooped old man suddenly grew angry and said harshly, Bai Shanshui, do not be too presumptuous. I respect you as an outstanding person. Do you really think that Fish Market is afraid of you? You are from the Qin, I am from the Wei. We are enemies to begin with. You respect me because you fear my strength. As to me, the destruction of the Wei is related to the Shang family. If not for the Shang family's reform that allowed the Qin dynasty to prosper, how could you have the power to destroy 3 dynasties? So I do not have as good of an impression of the Shang family as you imagine. Bai Shanshui smiled coldly and then shook his head at the stooped old man. He said, You are not a match for me. You are too old, you cannot even take one blow from me. Chapter 158. Those above Realm 7 were great grandmasters. Which one of them was not a true talent? The hunchbacked old man's black bamboo staff started to sway slightly. Even though he knew that Bai Shanshui's words were likely to be true, he still did not want to lower his head. But at this time, his hand suddenly relaxed. He took a deep breath and forced his anger to calm. The innocent will know they are innocent. Mr. Bai prioritizes the Wei people. Even if you have doubts, why rush? A weak but exceptionally calm female voice sounded. You force me out. What explanation do you want me to give you? Bai Shanshui slowly turned his head and looked at the red-robed woman holding a black zither who walked out from behind the hunchbacked old man. He sneered disdainfully. You dare to say that the innocent will know they are innocent. You dare to say that the people of Fish Market do not want my lonely mountain sword hoard and have not tried to investigate my whereabouts? The red-robed woman looked calmly at Bai Shanshui and said, Mr. Bai has the lonely mountain sword hoard and naturally understands that a man's wealth is his own ruin. Also, you said before that we are Qin and you are Wei. We are natural enemies. But if we kill you, we kill you. If we do not kill you, we do not kill you. The matter of killing your senior sect brother has nothing to do with Fish Market. Bai Shanshui's eyebrows rose. The red-robed woman said softly, I have said all I want to say. Even if Mr. Bai does not believe me, you must know that if we really fight for our lives here, even if this place is close to the Wei River, I think Mr. will not be able to escape unscathed. Bai Shanshui's eyebrows continued to rise. His long eyebrows gave off indescribable pride like 2 small swords. Whether you believe me or not, whether you can or can't, you have to try to know. He shook his head and looked at the red-robed woman. Will a person like me come to Fish Market for nothing? If other people called themselves a person like me, people would feel they were arrogant and ignorant. But when Bai Shanshui said this, it was natural. The hunchbacked old man suddenly became alert. But Bai Shanshui's right hand had flicked 3 times. 3 drops of water floated towards the hunchbacked old man. When they reached him, they magically turned into 3 transparent bubbles and wrapped around the old man's body. The woman in red seemed to have sensed something. She frowned slightly and reached out to play the zither. The strings of the zither vibrated. There was no sound, but countless black bamboos broke out of the ground. In an instant, the black bamboos were as dense as a forest, covering the sky and the sun. They formed a small world, covering all the yuan qi fluctuations in the area. Bai Shanshui walked forward slowly and confidently. Space and time seemed to have no boundaries before him. He arrived before the red-robed woman with a single step and reached out to strike her forehead. The red-robed woman raised her hand and clapped her palms together. Bai Shanshui had already retreated to her original spot. Countless wisps of black qi flowed in front of the red-robed woman. Her body shook slightly, and she took a step back. At the same time, the hunchbacked old man was so angry that his hair stood on end. Endless black gas surged out from under his feet, making the place where he stood not look like the ground, but like a passage to an endless, demonic realm. He extended the black bamboo cane in his hand and knocked it forward. However, what surprised him was that the 3 transparent water bubbles surrounding him were not as strong as he had imagined. With a strike of his black bamboo cane, the 3 transparent water bubbles suddenly collapsed. His attack seemed to have hit empty air with all his power. He felt indescribably sad. Bai Shanshui stood with his hands behind his back and looked silently at the countless black bamboos. The red-robed woman stepped in front of the hunchbacked old man. She pressed her hands on the zither and waited for Bai Shanshui to speak. However, at this moment, in the indescribably quiet black bamboo forest, a metallic voice rang out. "Someone is waiting for you on the river surface." Bai Shanshui frowned. His body did not move, but a sharp sword essence broke out of his body. A transparent watery light flew through the air and directly cut open a gap in the black bamboo forest. The person who spoke from the hole was in his 50s. His short hair reached his ears, and he dressed like a businessman. He did not have a powerful presence, but his expression was unspeakably calm. Facing Bai Shanshui's gaze, he showed a hint of rebelliousness. "Who is waiting for me on the river?" Bai Shanshui narrowed his eyes and said slowly, "With your weak cultivation, I can kill you at any time. So you better answer honestly." The short-haired man looked unconcernedly at Bai Shanshui. "I am just a messenger. If Mr. Bai finds it interesting, then kill me. I want to see who dares to meet me on the river." Bai Shanshui did not speak. His body moved, and he flashed out from the side of the short-haired man. In a moment, all of Fish Market was filled with white mist. A wave of white mist surged out from the side of Fish Market like a true dragon. The river was the river. Even if it was not stated, Bai Shanshui knew it had to be on the closest Wei River. The waves of the Wei River were great. In the winter, only 100 feet of the shore would freeze. While the snow had long melted and even the floating ice was gone, the water was still bone-chillingly cold. There were not even many boats fishing on the river. When Bai Shanshui stepped onto the river, he was a true serpent. Waves rose naturally and supported his body. In that instant, he saw a figure standing on a reef that was only a few feet high in the middle of the river. This figure was not tall, half a head shorter than him. He was standing motionlessly, but in Bai Shanshui's eyes, he was indescribably proud. He himself was the most unruly, unrestrained, and arrogant person in the world. But every cultivator in the world knew that the way Cloud Water Palace's method was strong when it encountered water. Once Bai Shanshui stepped onto this river, he would be at his strongest. But this person met him where Bai Shanshui was at his strongest. This person was even prouder than Bai Shanshui. Bai Shanshui stood motionless, but the waves pushed him faster than any boat in the world. Soon, he was only a few dozen feet from the person standing on the reef. Bai Shanshui paused when he felt the burning aura rippling in the air like red charcoal. His lips moved slightly as he said, "Fourth Mr. Zhao." In the next moment he sneered. "I was wondering who in the world could be so proud. Now I think it is only the swords of the Zhao sword furnace." The handsome young person standing on the reef was much shorter than ordinary men. His expression was calm, but his gaze was unimaginably sharp. This was the strongest of the Zhao sword furnace, Zhao Si. Hearing Bai Shanshui's words, Zhao Si said coolly, "You are very different from the rumored brute. You forced the eldest miss of the Shang family to fight at full power. I think you just want to test if she has just been through a fierce battle." Zhao Seven died in the streets of Chongling. Zhao Si and Zhao Yi appeared together in Chongling. Bai Shanshui looked scornfully at Zhao Si and said, "You did not meet me to praise me." Zhao Si did not disguise and said calmly, "Of course it is for the lonely mountain sword horde." Bai Shanshui smiled. His smile was unspeakably enchanting. "Everyone in the world wants the lonely mountain sword horde." Zhao Si glanced at him and said, "I am not like them. Other than the lonely mountain sword horde, I want to see your sword. Even without the lonely mountain sword horde, I want to see your sword." Bai Shanshui put away his smile and did not speak. Zhao Si continued, "My master's sword was formed in the past, and he wanted to see all the swords in the world. Later, he fell into a trap. Before he died, his only regret was that he did not have a chance to fight that person. I am his most trusted disciple and naturally have to fulfill his last wish. I have admired the way Cloudwater Palace's White Mountain Blackwater sword for a long time." Bai Shanshui said sarcastically, "It seems that the rumors are true. The people of the Zhao sword furnace are all crazy. Our paths are different in the end." Zhao Si looked at Bai Shanshui and said calmly, "All these years, your actions have always been with Wei as the leader. There is no hope of reviving the country, but you want to hold up a forest with your sword and shelter the remaining elders of the Wei dynasty. But the Zhao sword furnace is not like you. The Zhao sword furnace is just a place of pure cultivation. We have never had thoughts of serving a dynasty or a king. We only pursue the sword path of the Zhao sword furnace. We have a country in our hearts, but no king. Since the country does not exist, we only have enemies and the sword path we seek." In the eyes of many people, as great rebels, there were many possibilities of working together. But the true situation was that two tigers could not live on one mountain. Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si had not interacted for many years due to their different pursuits. Naturally, there was no regret that they had not met earlier. Also, no expert who was about to reach the peak would share the treasure in their hands with someone they had never met before. No one was willing to give up their high position to someone else, even if it was just a possibility, especially when facing someone like Zhao Si, who could decide the future of the world. Everyone wants to complete what they want to do. Bai Shanshui looked at Zhao Si and said slowly, "Everyone wants the Lonely Mountain Sword Horde, but the Lonely Mountain Sword Horde ended up in my hands. So I am fated." Then he took a deep breath and said even more slowly, "I have wanted to see the strongest sword of the Zhao sword furnace for a long time." Chapter 159. Those above Realm 7 were grandmasters who controlled the world. True rebels had extraordinary presence. Most of the Realm 7 grandmasters in the world had never seen Bai Shanshui and the legendary 4th Mr. Zhao, but most knew they were not a match for Bai Shanshui and 4th Mr. Zhao. It was not a problem of cultivation methods and sword manuals. There was never a strongest sword manual, only stronger people. The Wei and Zhao dynasties had countless cultivation places. The reason only Bai Shanshui of Cloudwater Palace and 4th Mr. Zhao of the Zhao Sword Furnace were recognized as extraordinary existences was because they were the strongest people and possessed a spirit ordinary people could not imagine. When Bai Shanshui and 4th Mr. Zhao met, how could this be an ordinary battle between Realm 7s? Hearing Bai Shanshui's slow words, 4th Mr. Zhao still stood with his hands behind his back. But the white clouds above the river suddenly turned red and turned into fiery clouds. Bai Shuai expressionlessly reached out with his hand. The roaring river in front of him suddenly stopped flowing. Half of the river was cut off, not by a powerful force, but by a mountainous primal energies of the universe, forming a spinning pool in front of him. Countless water grasses at the bottom of the river were exposed to the sunlight. Countless fish and shrimps jumped in confusion and terror in the dehydrated sand, not knowing what had happened. Seeing half of the river turn into a jade pool, and the bottom of the river turn into a plain, fourth Mr. Zhao had an expression of admiration. My generation likes to learn the sword, and spent 10 years in a cold pool. He first recited a line that Bai Shuai had sung and fought in Chongling. Then he looked at the jade pool that gave off astounding sword essence and praised, "It seems this is the life-bond sword you spent 10 years to cultivate." Bai Shuai did not answer. A thick green flame rose from the jade pool. A thick green longsword was pulled out of the pool and landed in his hand. After this sword was pulled out of the jade pool, the spinning pool in front of him seemed to lose its soul, turning to ordinary water and scattering into the dehydrated riverbed. The fish and shrimps felt the world around them being filled with the water they relied on to survive. They did not feel joy, but fled from this area in terror. The green color of the long sword was deeper and brighter than any gemstone, but the inside of the sword was black and white, vaguely resembling a white mountain and black water. Bai Shuai held the sword and looked indifferently at Zhao Si. "My sword is already in my hand. Now let me see your sword." Zhao Si nodded, then looked up into the sky and said, "Then take this strike of mine." Bai Shuai sensed something and looked up into the sky. High up in the sky, which no one could see with their eyes, the natural powers were getting thinner and thinner. At the height where the natural powers were so thin that they had almost completely disappeared, there were many magical light arcs, disordered star powers, the essence fire of the sun, and both extreme coldness and extreme heat. There was a small red sword floating inside, receiving the washing and tempering of the extreme cold and heat. It moved along a fixed path like a star, but there was a thought connected to Zhao Si. His thoughts were so great that even his life-bond sword flew in the sky like a star. Not many people could understand what fourth Mr. Zhao meant by sacrificing himself to seek the path. In this moment, the small sword seemed to wake up. Before it accelerated, it gave off crimson flames and then started to fall at a terrifying speed. The crimson-red flames and the primal energies of the universe rubbed against each other, causing the flames to grow fiercer. In a fraction of a breath, the layer of true fire outside the sword became pure and colorless. Under the impact of the terrifying speed and the pressure of the surrounding primal energies of the universe, it turned into a layer of glass-like matter that stuck tightly to the sword. The fire outside the sword turned crimson and became more and more intense. When it really passed through the burning clouds on the river surface and appeared in Bai Shuai's sight, it had already become a huge crimson fireball with a flame tail more than 10 miles long. Such a ball of fire could be seen from many high places in Chongling. On a stargazing platform in the imperial palace of the Qin dynasty, a historian saw a shooting star like this in the day and paled. A falling star in the day, deep red in color. This is a demon star. Wild winds howled on the river surface. Fourth Mr. Zhao's sword was still dozens of feet away from the river surface. The river water under Bai Shuai's feet had dried up layer by layer, turning into steam with terrifying heat. Bai Shuai's eyes showed true shock. Seeing such a sword, he finally believed that the legend of the Grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace burning the lake with one sword in the war between the Qin and Zhao was true. This was a sword that contained the true fire of the star and the furnace of the world. But he did not think he would lose. This was a great river connected to the sea, and not a sealed lake. He took a deep breath. A unique wave of primal energies of the universe was released from his body and landed in the river water under his feet. He seemed to be one with the entire Wei River. He swung his sword at the ball of fire like a demon star. Vast blue waves surged from the surface of the river, and the terrifying qi of heaven and earth was summoned from afar. However, it did not travel in the air, but in the deep water. It was like a real dragon swimming in the water, and finally converged into the dark green long sword in his hand. White mountains and black water came out of the sword like they were creating a unique world. The two colors of sword chi rapidly transformed in front of him. First, it formed a huge white coiling snake. It opened its huge mouth and bit at the falling fireball. Then, the black color behind the white color condensed into a huge black turtle. The energies of the white snake and black turtle resonated with the stars in the sky. The yin and yang changed, creating the Xuanwu essence that was both offensive and defensive. The moment the white coiled snake opened its mouth, a ball of cold blue sword energy flashed and immediately extinguished half of the deep red ball of fire. Zhao Ci's eyes started to give off heated light. The small sword in the center of the crimson fireball suddenly cut out countless paths in the air according to his will. In an instant, tens of thousands of glazed crystal light poured down. When the two collided, the cold dark green sword light was immediately eliminated. A cracking sound was heard. The white snake caught his small sword in its mouth, but could not stop it at all. It exploded from the snake's head. Bai Shanshui exclaimed softly. Balls of black fiendish energy rose like clouds. In a flash, all the water and fire disappeared. Only a thin ring of mist spread on the river surface. Bai Shanshui, holding the green sword, was in front of fourth Mr. Zhao. Bai Shanshui stabbed with his sword. The sword he stabbed at fourth Mr. Zhao did not have any dazzling light or shadow, but when this sword stabbed out, the waves on the river completely disappeared, and the great river instantly became deathly still. This was his most powerful sword strike. Not only did it contain his most powerful essence, energy, and spirit, it also contained the heavenly Tao of water. Fourth Mr. Zhao made a soft sound of surprise. But he only made a sound of surprise. The small sword with a layer of fire flowing on it landed in front of him. He gripped the small sword simply and stabbed at Bai Shanshui. There was a loud bang. Fourth Mr. Zhao's small sword and Bai Shanshui's green sword collided and gave off endless flows of heat. Fourth Mr. Zhao's expression was cold. He seemed to be in the smithy of the past. Facing the flow of the river, all the fires in the smithy seemed to be extinguished. Yet a scene from the past appeared in his mind. In the pouring rain, a weathered and unruly man held a red-hot hammer and swung it down, creating sparks. In the next moment, he put the red-hot hammer and the sword he had just struck into the water under the eaves. There was a hiss. The red hammer and sword turned black and cold. At this time, a sound sounded in front of fourth Mr. Zhao. The heat of the small sword in his hand disappeared, turning into black and cold metal as it continued to move forward. The green long sword in Bai Shanshui's hand suddenly shook, and his entire body flew backwards. His feet never left the surface of the water. As his figure floated up, a huge wave suddenly swept up behind him on the surface of the river. Fourth Mr. Zhao's figure did not move. The small sword in his hand recovered its red color and slowly lowered. His clothing was disheveled, and countless strands of hair flew behind his head. To everyone's shock, he revealed his female appearance. What was even more shocking was Bai Shanshui. Countless ripping sounds came from his body. His white fox fur coat split open, revealing a snow-white area on his chest. There was actually a deep ravine. As his figure took several steps back, the tattered fox fur coat scattered. His figure was graceful, and he did not have his usual manliness. He was clearly a tall and beautiful woman. Fourth Mr. Zhao's expression did not change. He looked at Bai Shanshui and said, "So the strongest rebel in the world, Bai Shanshui, is a woman." Bai Shanshui's presence was disordered, and he revealed his true appearance. His face was covered in frost. He said, "Are you not the same?" Fourth Mr. Zhao looked coolly at him and said, "The Zhao have many widows and women. The men of the Zhao had mostly died before the Zhao were destroyed. It is normal that most of the remaining are women." Bai Shanshui took a breath. While he did not use vital energy to control his body and return to his female appearance, he was still heroic and had an indescribable charm. Her expression calmed, and she looked coldly at fourth Mr. Zhao. She said, "It seems that I can only call you fourth Miss Zhao in the future." Fourth Mr. Zhao retorted, "Before entering the sect, I was called Zhao Miao, but I do not know Miss Bai's name. Bai Shanshui only means white mountain and black water, and is not your true name." Bai Shanshui's eyes immediately showed hints of embarrassment, but she still gritted her teeth and said, "I am Bai Lu." Fourth Mr. Zhao said calmly, "Bai Lu is Frost, a good name." Bai Shanshui sneered, "While you won by half a move, it is impossible to keep me here. Do you think you can humiliate me with words?" Fourth Mr. Zhao shook his head and said calmly, "I am just surprised." After saying this, she looked at the distant Chongling and slowly said, "Chongling is the place that nurtures true dragons. The strongest cultivators in the world all come from Chongling. Is this true? It seems that you have had some fortuitous encounters in these days in Chongling. Otherwise, I think I would not have just won by half a move." Bai Shanshui's lips trembled. She knew fourth Mr. Zhao spoke the truth. The river water surged along with her emotions. At this moment, there was an additional white and graceful figure on the surface of the river. Chapter 160. There was more than one woman in Chongling who could walk on the waves as though they were flat ground, but only one of them liked to wear white. There were rumors that she was doing this to worship that person. She was using the gray-black color of Chongling to express dissatisfaction, so she had been exiled overseas. Yet she had returned from the storm and killed Zhao Zhan with one blow. She was naturally the bureau chief of the astrology bureau, Yi Sealing. In a few breaths, she was on the water near by Shan Shui and Zhao Si. Originally, it was a gathering of heroes, but now, it has become a show between three women. Yi Sealing looked disdainfully at Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si. He said, "The two most famous heroes in the world are both women. If the news spreads, those arrogant men should find a piece of tofu to kill themselves." Bai Shanshui glanced at Yi Sealing. At this time, her clothing was disheveled, but she had recovered her calm and her usual arrogance. "You're also here. It seems you started the matter of killing my senior sect brother and luring me into fish market?" she said with a cold smile, her eyes narrowed slightly. Yi Sealing glanced casually at her and said, "You and I are enemies. Why do I have to give you an explanation? Why do you have to be troubled by such a problem?" Zhao Si said coolly, "We are all people in the game. There is no need to distinguish between us. If this is a trap set by her, she is not the only one here. She is just borrowing the sword to kill. But what is laughable is that the Yuanwu Emperor is realm 8. There are so many realm 7 cultivators in Chongling, so many marquises, generals, and ministers, but only one woman dares to come here and fight to the death with us." Bai Shanshui thought for a moment, straightened her clothing, and sneered. "It is to deal with the Deer Mountain Conference. They do not dare to be injured." Yi Sealing looked at Zhao Si and smiled, showing two faint dimples. "Fourth Mr. Zhao, you two have expended a lot of energy. Neither of you is a match for me right now. Why don't we work together and kill Bai Shanshui? You take the lonely mountain sword horde, and I take her for the reward. This is fair. We have stayed long enough." Zhao Si turned to look at Bai Shanshui and said, "What do you think?" Bai Shanshui sneered and said, "Even if we join hands to kill her, we will definitely be injured and fall into someone else's trap. At that time, out of the 4 most wonderful women in the world, 3 will die in an instant, and only Zheng Xiu will be left. She will be very happy at that time." Anyone who talked about themselves, especially when praising others, would feel strange. However, when she talked about it, it always made people feel that it was natural. Zhao Si smiled faintly and said, "You say that the most exciting in the world right now are the 4 women. I can agree with this number, but you say there is Zheng Xiu among them. Her cultivation is high, but she relied on schemes and the power of men to sit in the middle palace. How is she exciting?" Speaking of the 4, the eldest miss of the Gongsun family and the eldest miss of the Shang family are stronger than her in my eyes. Yi Sealing frowned and pouted like an innocent young girl. He said mockingly, "In the world of cultivators, women are not as good as men. This is a fact. The number of Realm's 7 female cultivators in the world can be counted on one hand. They are not as good as men. You too find it interesting to boast about yourselves here? You are the same as us, but you insist on staying in Chongling to be a sword in someone's hand." Zhao Si was the shortest of the three, but her gaze was the sharpest. She swept a glance and seemed to see through Yi Xiling. She said coldly, "You are putting yourself in danger. What are you scheming? As a chess piece, can you flip out of the hands of the one who placed the piece? Also, in Chongling, there is more than one person who can place a piece above you." Bai Shanshui laughed as though no one was around. Maybe she also wants to be the empress? Yi Xiling was not angry. 2 small dimples appeared on his cheeks again. "I want to. If I succeed, I have to thank you for your auspicious words." Yi Xiling usually roared in the mountains and forests with her sword. If she did not feel like it, she would strike with her sword. She was more arrogant than most men, but in terms of bickering, she was not a match for Yi Xiling. Hearing Yi Xiling's response, she grew angry and narrowed her eyes again. Zhao Si looked coolly at Yi Xiling and said, "I see that you have not given up. I heard that the 9-death silkworm has appeared, so you have returned from overseas?" Yi Xiling frowned and said, "You do not need to test me with words, and do not need to act like you are thinking for me. Zhao Shan died at my hands. I think that if we meet, one of us will die." Zhao Si's expression did not change. She said coolly, "I think that the person who set up this situation today also feels that I will kill you. The people of the Zhao sword furnace cultivate the sword of death. But this person did not expect that my path is not here. So many people of the Zhao sword furnace have died, so many people have died, just to complete Teacher's path. Teacher's path is the path I will walk today." After a pause, Zhao Si slowly raised the small sword in her hand and said coolly, "Since you have come today, you will act it out to the end. Let me experience your one sky water first." Yi Xiling did not speak and looked up into the sky. There seemed to be a mountain flying in the sky. A glowing water droplet appeared in her hand and then turned into a sword. In the previous battle with Bai Shanshui, Zhao Si had always been the last to move. Even when Bai Shanshui was at her strongest, she had still won and wounded Bai Shanshui. But now, she was the first to move. The power in her body suddenly exploded, flooding into the small sword in her hand and gathering at the tip of the small sword. Her body was like an enormous furnace, and the tip of the small sword seemed to give birth to a crimson star. Yi Xiling stabbed with his sword. The sword in her hand suddenly disappeared when she stabbed. Her sword had never existed before, but now it had disappeared. An extremely soft power wrapped around the small crimson sword in Zhao Si's hand, causing this small sword that seemed to carry a star forward to be unable to move forward. Zhao Si frowned slightly. So Bureau Chief Ye's strongest skill is not the storm, but the method of using soft to subdue hard. She shook her head and spoke. Then she released her hand. In the battle with Bai Shanshui, she had lost much of her energy, and her killing intent had disappeared. Since she could not defeat Yi Xiling's attack and could not advance, she retreated. She released her hand. The small crimson sword shook, retreated, and flew into the sky. In the blink of an eye, the small sword had already flown into the endless sky, towards where it came from. Her figure, like a real flying sword, broke through the air and flew backwards. As Zhao Si retreated, Bai Shanshui threw the thick green long sword in her hand down. This simple toss caused Bai Shanshui to cough up a mouthful of blood. The water in the river immediately disappeared. But unlike before, the fish and shrimps had fled far away. Only the aquatic plants at the bottom of the river lay weakly in the slightly damp sand. The thick green longsword disappeared, and an enormous spinning pool immediately covered Yi Xiling. Yi Xiling gave a long howl. Her body was like a heavy rock that had landed at the bottom of the pool. She released waves of vital energy. With a great boom, a torrential rain started to pour from the river. But these raindrops did not fall from the sky, but from the depths of the river towards the sky. The glowing water droplets that formed around her cut into the spinning pool, turning into more water that sprayed into the sky. In a flash, the glowing water droplets formed thousands of small glowing swords that formed a sword formation. Yi Sealing took a deep breath and gave another howl. A mouthful of bright red blood dripped down from the corner of her tightly pressed lips. The thousands of small glowing swords stabbed out together into the pool. The pool was like a serpent pinned by thousands of small swords, unable to summon wind and rain. In the next moment, it turned into countless streams of water that charged towards the bottom of the river.
Poof!
Like a giant dragon spitting out a pearl, Yi Sealing was charged out of the river by a powerful wave of energy. As she started to fall from the sky, the river closed, the waves surged, and Bai Shanshui was nowhere to be seen. Drops of blood bloomed on her white robes like red plum blossoms. In the muddy river water, a faint stream of blood spread like a wounded serpent leaving behind a trail. Yi Sealing coughed softly. It was not clear whether her dim eyes were filled with regret or joy. At this time, deep in the imperial palace of the Qin dynasty, in a square copper palace, the Yuanwu emperor, the strongest emperor in the history of the Qin dynasty, slowly raised his head. He was dressed in casual robes, his hair uncombed, and his appearance unkempt. Above Realm 8, there were wonders that Realm 7 could not imagine. There seemed to be countless stars flowing in his eyes. Zhao Ci's sword was like a falling demon star. It was too powerful. As it flew back into the sky like it was returning to its scabbard, he caught its trajectory. He took a deep breath and raised his hands slightly. He could not help but want to attack. But other people could not sense it. For a cultivator of his cultivation, this was a long hesitation. His hands hung down, and his fingers flicked slightly. In the Empress study, the patio above the spirit spring suddenly shot out countless pure rays of light. The rays of light crisscrossed. The points of intersection became brighter, like countless small stars floating above the multiple lotuses in the spirit spring. A hint of coldness flowed across the Empress' flawless face. She raised her left hand, and numerous pure rays of light shot out of her fingertips. In the sky, the crimson-red sword was about to return to its fixed trajectory and float down. But at this time, in the cold space above, starlight like the tail of a comet surged out. They turned into pale, white pillars of fire without any warmth and swept onto the crimson-red sword. Zhao Ci had landed on a mountain peak. Her eyes were filled with shock and anger. With a pop, she vomited a mouthful of blood. She could not control her body and fell to the ground. In the sky, the light in the seal scripts of the crimson-red sword was extinguished. It was scorched black, turning into a piece of rusted iron and falling to an unknown place. Chapter 161. The Life Bond Sword was an item that cultivated both life and life. Especially for a life bond sword like 4th Mr. Zhao Miao's, the sword embryo was not an ordinary item. Who knew how many years of hard work she had spent to cultivate to her current state? Today it was destroyed. Her energy C and mental power were both heavily injured. Naturally, she was extremely shocked and angry. While you destroyed my life bond sword, you cannot kill me today. I have seen a thread of Realm 8. It will be harder to kill me in the future. Yet this fury immediately turned into a kind of tenacity and sharpness in her eyes. This kind of adversity seemed to stimulate her desire to pursue the sword path of the sword furnace. Why is it like this? At this time, a furious young man with thick brows appeared on the peak.
It was Zhao Yi.
Bazin Kendo Ground's Starfire Comet Tail Sword. The one who attacked was Zheng Xiu. Zhao Miao coughed out a mouthful of strange pink blood and sneered. She just borrowed some of the Yuanwu Emperor's power. Today, she made me suffer a blow. In the future, I will pay her back. Zhao Yi took a deep breath and nodded. This was natural for him, who also came from the sword furnace. But at this time, Zhao Miao's gaze flashed violently. She said coldly, "Go find Bai Shanshui." Zhao Yi stilled. In his view, While Bai Shanshui had been greatly wounded in battle, he may not be a match for her at this time. Also, when Bai Shanshui entered the Wei River, she was a true serpent entering the estuary. He could not find Bai Shanshui. Also, Zhao Miao was seriously injured. This place was extremely dangerous. The most important thing was to immediately escort her away. Bai Shanshui will not go far. I am not telling you to chase after her. Zhao Miao glanced at him, her expression growing colder. Today, this is a grand scheme. The person who set up this grand scheme will not let us leave easily. My life bond sword is destroyed. For those people in Chongling, I am not as important as Bai Shanshui, who carries the secrets of the Lonely Mountain Sword Hoard. Even if I cannot take the Lonely Mountain Sword Hoard, I will not let it fall into the hands of the person who set this up. Zhao Yi glanced at her, his expression still hesitant. Zhao Miao looked down, her face filled with indescribable murderousness. While I am seriously injured, it will not be so easy for these people from Chongling to kill me. Zhao Yi was stunned. He sensed an indescribable presence coming from Zhao Miao. This presence, in his memories, seemed to have appeared on the teacher everyone in the Zhao sword furnace respected greatly. Be careful. He didn't say anything else. He took a deep breath and nodded. When Zhao Yi and Bai Shanshui disappeared, Yi Xiling felt tired. She sat down on the rock where Mr. Zhao Miao had been standing. Then, she sensed a subtle change in qi activity in the direction of the imperial city. Then, she sensed a violent fluctuation in the endless sky. She knew more about the Yuanwu Emperor and Zheng Xiu than almost all the cultivators in the world. In the past, when the Qin had destroyed the three dynasties, she had seen Zheng Xiu's starfire comet tail sword sweep down from the sky like a true comet tail more than once. Zheng Xiu's sword essence, where the sword and star became one, was similar to Zhao Miao's sword essence that had been tempered by starfire and turned into a meteor. While it was not as direct and sharp as Zhao Miao's sword essence, Zheng Xiu's life-bond sword was hidden somewhere in the stars. It was only the sword that broke the starfire. But Zheng Xiu's cultivation was slightly higher than Zhao Miao's, and clearly, she had received help from the Yuanwu Emperor. She could imagine the outcome of Zhao Miao's life-bond sword. For the greatest rebel of the Qin dynasty, Mr. Zhao Miao's life-bond sword being destroyed was like cutting off an arm of Mr. Zhao Miao's. Just from this, the person who set this trap today was very generous. But would it stop here? Was the one who set this trap today the Yuanwu Emperor, the Empress, the two ministers, or someone else? Of the three people caught in this trap, only she knew who had killed Fan Zhua. Only she knew that while she had Han Sanshi conceal the presence of the Nine-Hell King sword that day, the presence that had led Bai Shanshui to Fish Market had not been her handiwork. Other than the former Shang family, who else in the court was a powerful cultivator of the Qi Ghost Bamboo sect? To be able to set up such a trap there, they should know that she had concealed the matter of Fan Zhua and the Nine-Hell King sword. Then what would they do to her next? Women are often stubborn. Thinking of Zhao Miao's words and how he still chose to stay in Chongling, Yi Xiling smiled self-deprecatingly and said to himself. In the middle of the river, Bai Shanshui stood silently like a water immortal moving with the flow. Using some kind of secret art, her breathing did not seem to be obstructed in this flow of water. All the blood on her body had been washed clean. Her presence was as pure as the cleanest water, but her face was pale. She did not know much about the powerful secret arts of the Bazin Kendo ground, but when Zhao Miao's life-bond sword was destroyed, she had sensed the powerful energy collision in the sky. She knew that only the few people in the Chongling Imperial Palace could do such a thing. At this time, she realized that the one who set up this trap today was not as simple as a marquis. The secret arts of Cloud Water Palace could allow her to stay in the water for dozens of days and cause her presence to completely merge with the flow of water. Even if Emperor Yuanwu, a Realm 8, came to the surface of the river, she was confident she would not be detected. Yet when fourth Mr. Zhao Miao's life-bond sword was destroyed, she felt great unease. She felt that in this grand scheme, this was just the beginning. When this feeling of unease rose, She no longer hesitated. She took out a glass pill bottle from her sleeve, poured out the only blood-red pill inside, and put it into her mouth. A sickly blush appeared on her face. The water flow that wrapped around her didn't seem to be any different, but her figure within it was more than twice as fast, turning into a white flowing shadow. In less than the time it took to brew a cup of tea, the water she was in became deeper. In the dark water in front of her, a huge white shadow appeared and rapidly approached her. This was an enormous white carp, its eyes flashing with intelligence. This was a friend Bai Shanshui had made when she cultivated the sword in the water many years ago. Usually, she would be overjoyed to see this white carp, but the moment she saw this white carp, she suddenly realized where her great unease came from. No, she gave a shrill cry in the water. A string of air and sound waves exploded in front of her. In this moment, the enormous white shadow suddenly froze in the water. A circle of red light spread along its head, dyeing the world in front of Bai Shanshui and her eyes red. My generation likes to learn the sword. 10 years in the cold pool. One day, I killed the serpent, the blue water crimson, for 3 months. Today, I will fight Chongling, and in the future, I will kill the Qin king? Ha ha ha, Bai Shanshui. You were arrogant in Chongling back then, but you did not expect that in the eyes of the emperor. You are just a stray dog. A wave of arrogant laughter caused the water to explode. A figure dressed in ordinary gray robes gripped one of the white carp's whiskers with one hand and pulled the white carp's head into his hand. At the same time, a terrifying sword essence came from his right hand. The inky green sword light was like an enormous water plant that surged in front of Bai Shanshui. There was an explosion on the originally calm river surface, and a huge water column with a radius of over 100 feet appeared. Bai Shanshui was forced out of the water by this sword. Lianbo! Bai Shanshui was furious. With a shout, she gripped the green sword in her hand. That gray figure had floated to the surface of the water. This was a middle-aged man holding an inky green sword. He was dressed in the most ordinary gray robes of Chongling. His features were ordinary, but there was a straight sword mark and the brand of a prisoner on his forehead. He looked shocking to the eye. At this time, this man casually threw away the white carp's head. He looked at Bai Shanshui and said emotionally, "After 19 years, we finally meet again." Bai Shanshui laughed in anger. As a person of Wei, you have become a marquis of the Qin dynasty. You have enjoyed all the glory and wealth. You still remember your past grudges and the enmity of your sect. This powerful cultivator with the straight sword mark and the brand of a prisoner could only be Marquis Lian of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. While he had land and a marquis establishment in Chongling, he usually guarded the Xiongqiang region. He had great power among the vassal countries in that region and was called half the king of Chong. Now, he had been secretly moved to Chongling and appeared in front of Bai Shanshui. Also, from Bai Shanshui's words, Marquis Lian was a person of Wei. Lian Bo touched the scar on his forehead and smiled. But his smile was slightly bleak. If not for the fact that your Cloudwater Palace was so powerful in the past and the sects that disagreed with you were eradicated, the Wei would not have been unable to recover. Even if it could not escape the fate of destruction, it would not have been destroyed so quickly. If we really want to argue, it is not about who is the true culprit behind the destruction of the Wei. Now, the Wei has been destroyed for so many years, but you are still focused on serving the country. Think about it, because of your existence, the Qin always had a bad attitude towards the Wei people. You want the Wei people to have good lives, but you do not know that those people have bad lives because of people like you. Bai Shanshui sneered in disdain. After being a dog for so many years, you really think like a dog. Lian Bo narrowed his eyes and smiled. He said, "The king of Wei's bones are probably rotten by now. There is no meaning in saying this. I only remember that when my sect was destroyed, my teachers and senior brothers all died under your sword." Bai Shanshui did not look at him. He looked coldly at the sword in his hand and the blood of the white carp spreading in the water. He said, "Your family in the past has all died, but now you have more family in the marquis establishment than before. Lian Bo understood the meaning of Bai Shanshui's words. He took a deep breath and said seriously, "So, even if I die today, I will have you die here." Chapter 162. Bai Shanshui smiled coldly. Just like how Liang Lian was also Realm 7, but she did not think much of him. Usually, a Realm 7 cultivator like Liang Lian was not a match for her, but the other had the ability to kill her right now. Also, Lian Bo was one of the 13 marquises. Even Liang Lian had so many powerful subordinates. Today, Lian Bo was determined to kill her here. How could he be alone? 3 small boats appeared on the misty surface of the river. There was a person standing on each of the 3 small boats. One of them was bald and wore large silver earrings. He was dressed in strange clothes. One of them was elegant, dressed like a scholar. The last one was covered in iron armor and carried 2 swords on his back. He weighed down the small boat to the point that it almost sank into the water. These 3 were naturally the 3 experts under Lian Bo's command, Zhang Guangdao, Lu Zongtong, and Li Daozhou. "You are willing to spend." Bai Shanshui looked disdainfully at Lian Bo. In the next moment, her face became expressionless. A wave rose from under her feet as she charged towards Zhang Guangdao. Zhang Guangdao was originally from the Chang people and was originally a horse gang on the border. He had been defeated by Lian Bo a few years ago. After being trained by Lian Bo, his cultivation had improved by leaps and bounds. However, since Lian Bo and Bai Shanshui were old enemies, Bai Shanshui naturally knew his subordinates very well. She knew that Zhang Guangdao was the weakest of the 3, so the first thing she wanted to do was to break through Zhang Guangdao. At this time, Lian Bo was of great status in the Qin dynasty. He had spent a great deal of effort to sneak back to Chongling. He had stayed in the water for more than a dozen days to track Bai Li. Bai Shanshui had previously said that if he escaped, she would slaughter the Lian Marquisate establishment. But when Bai Shanshui charged towards Zhang Guangdao, he only smiled disdainfully and did not move. "Ha ha ha ha, good." Bai Shanshui was so famous, but seeing Bai Shanshui charge over, Zhang Guangdao laughed madly instead. His mouth was large, and when he laughed, his mouth took up half of his face. Bai Shanshui's breathing suddenly stopped, and she felt danger again. At this moment, Zhang Guangdao's hands surged with true essence. With a loud clang, he opened a copper box in his hand. The bottom of this copper box was made of a silver-white crystal. The runes engraved on it were like an ancient palace. And on this strange silver-white crystal, there were dozens of extremely thin silver-white iron small swords floating like stars in the starry sky. These dozens of small silver swords were not much larger than the bamboo sticks that ordinary people use to pick their teeth. But at this time, Zhang Guangdao's vital energy flooded into the bottom of the copper box. These dozens of small silver swords gave off a presence as heavy as a mountain. To be more precise, each of the dozens of small silver swords exuded an aura like that of a tin mountain. Bai Shanshui's expression changed drastically. She could feel the aura rushing into her body. Even her mouth and nose could smell the astringent smell. Her chest felt like it was filled with countless pieces of tin. Tin mountain sword box. Li Lingjun. She realized what this was, and an even colder chill rose in her heart. Even the strongest seal soldier of the Chu dynasty, what Li Lingjun used to protect his life, had appeared in the hands of Lian Bo's 3 subordinates. This trap even included Li Lingjun. To make Li Lingjun pay such a price, then what was the reward? Time was too short, and she did not have time to think of more possibilities. The thick green longsword in her hand vibrated countless times, each time sending out terrifying primal energies of the universe. The sword essence that had been moving forward rose layer by layer. Countless mirror-like water curtains appeared in front of Bai Shanshui. At this time, dozens of small silver-white iron swords flew out of the copper box in Zhang Guangdao's hand. When each small sword flew out of the copper box, its trajectory had already been planned by the runes in the copper box. Zhang Guangdao had used almost all of his vital energy to activate the vast power of the sword box at the start, just to ensure that these small swords would not be destroyed by external power. At this time, the material of these small swords and their trajectories naturally formed a large formation and brought out even more terrifying power. Boom, boom, boom. Countless explosions sounded in front of Bai Shanshui. In this moment, it was like countless tin mountains were smashing into her sword moves. Bai Shanshui was already on the defensive. When the sword formation formed by the tin swords came, her first instinct was that she could block it. She even had the thought that nothing was more than that. But in the next moment, her true perception made her realize that she was no longer the same as before. Her breathing became extremely difficult. Her chest had been stuffed with many pieces of tin, but now, these pieces of tin seemed to have many edges and gave off powder. She felt a strong sense of disgust. She tasted sweetness in her throat, and then vomited blood uncontrollably. Disdain rose in Lianbo's eyes. How could Bai Shanshui compare to someone who could set up such a situation? She had been the weakest person on the river, but with the tin mountain sword box in hand, her attack was even stronger than his. How could Bai Shanshui withstand it?
Poof, poof, poof.
Bai Shanshui vomited a mouthful of blood. She took 3 steps back like she was standing on solid ground, and 3 enormous, white lotus-like splashes exploded under her. Her hair that had just been tied up was disheveled again, and her breathing was slightly disorderly. But at this time, Lianbo sensed something and suddenly turned his head. On the riverbank, a figure emitting a blazing heat appeared. His aura was like a prairie fire, causing the reeds by the riverbank to burn fiercely in an instant. I am Zhao Yi of the Zhao Sword Furnace. If you believe me, come ashore. I will guarantee you will not die. A calm shout with fanatical thirst for battle sounded from the fire plains. Bai Shanshui did not hesitate at all. With a wild laugh, the green color of the thick green sword in her hand faded. Her body was wrapped in a layer of green flow, and she was at the center of a large green sword. Careful. Lianbo's expression changed. His inky green sword flew out of his hand and charged towards the large green sword like a serpent.
Ah!
Lu Zongtong, dressed as a scholar, exclaimed. A small crimson sword appeared in his hand, and a large ball of sword shadows appeared like a blooming crabapple. However, with a cracking sound, his body and the small boat beneath his feet were cut in half by the dark green greatsword.
Boom!
Lianbo's sword charged towards Bai Shanshui, but Bai Shanshui did not care at all. The large green sword crashed into the water. She spat out several mouthfuls of blood. Riding the momentum, she was only dozens of feet away from the shore.
Go!
Leave this place to me. The thick-browed Zhao Yi stepped in front of her and blocked the remnant sword essence coming from the river. Bai Shanshui's mouth was filled with blood, but at this time, she turned and smiled arrogantly at Lianbo. I killed one of your confidants in front of you. What can you do to me now? You also seek death. Lianbo had waited 19 years. Just as he was about to get his revenge, such a change occurred. He was so angry, he could not control his emotions. There was a loud boom. The inky green sword sucked out a ball of water dozens of feet wide from the river surface, like a serpent drinking water. This ball of water strangely flew with the inky green sword and smashed towards Zhao Yi.
Zhao Si? I said I am Zhao Yi.
Hearing Lianbo's angry shout and seeing such a sword, Zhao Yi laughed maniacally. In the past years, he had traveled the world with Zhao Si. Zhao Si had purposefully trained him. He had seen many, but had not had many chances to fight. Seeing Lianbo's sword strike to his heart's content, his mind was also satisfied. He carried an old and worn umbrella on his back. As he laughed, he flipped his hand and pulled out a large black sword from the umbrella. There were no fancy moves at all. He simply swung this large sword and met force with force. It was as if he was swinging a giant hammer at the incoming dark green large sword. There was a loud bang. Just like how he had shattered the true fire serpent of a yen cultivator in the Chongling suburbs, the energy around Lian Bo's sword was shattered with one blow. The huge ball of water condensed on the sword did not have any effect at all. It was directly shattered and splashed back into countless streams of water. But as one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty, Lian Bo's full power attack in his fury was not so easy to deal with. He was still dozens of feet from the shore, but when he reached out his hand, the returning water wrapped around his arm. The water was like an extension of his arm. He seemed to be gripping the inky green sword that had been hit. Then he shouted, and the inky green sword pressed forward like a mountain. Zhao Yi's eyes were blazing with flames. Magma-like flames ignited between his feet and the ground. His body seemed to be unable to withstand this kind of power and was about to fly backwards. But he still had a sword. He had two swords. He always used one to smash and the other to fly against his enemies. A wave of fire exploded from his sleeve. The small sword, so red it was almost black, accelerated and slashed at the water behind the inky green sword. There was a hiss. The water was cut off, and the inky green sword was sent flying backwards. Zhao Yi laughed madly. The 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty are just this. Chapter 163. When Lian Bo's sword was broken, the qi in his body shook violently. For a moment, he couldn't say anything. Seeing that Zhao Yi could still laugh wildly, he felt a trace of coldness in his body. Bai Shanshui's vital energy cultivation most likely surpassed Realm 7 second class. But they were both Realm 7 third class. His cultivation would not be shorter than Zhao Yi's, and he had experienced many years of fighting in the Xiongqiang region. But now he was not even a match for Zhao Yi. Did he really lack the spirit to conquer the mountains and rivers compared to these great rebels? In today's small situation, Zhang Guangdao with the tin mountain sword box had the weakest cultivation, but he was the most important person. Amidst Zhao Yi's wild laughter, his expression was dark. He channeled all of his remaining vital energy into the seal weapon in his hand. There was a loud boom. With his vital energy used up, he could not control the recoil of the tin mountain sword box. As he lost his footing, the little boat under him flipped over. His body fell into the water. At the same time, the dozens of small swords flew out again. These dozens of small swords led the vast primal energies of the universe through the air. They did not stab towards Zhao Yi, but towards Bai Shanshui, who was walking behind him. The sword formation formed by the dozens of small swords fell down like a prison and wanted to trap Bai Shanshui within. Sensing the movement of these small swords, Bai Shanshui had no intentions of attacking. His eyes were extremely cold and filled with madness. The Qin does not feel shame using the Chu sword. Zhao Yi laughed maniacally. As he laughed, his small sword, so red it was almost black, curved in the air and sliced towards these small swords. With an enormous boom, black and red true fire appeared above his head. It was like an enormous cauldron in the air that caught these small swords and started to refine them. Pew 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 pew, dozens of sounds rang out. The vast energies gathered by these dozens of small swords were all burned into the air and scattered by the waves of fire. At this time, Li Daozhou attacked. Dressed in iron armor, Li Daozhou was the true commander of Lian Bo's army. In these years of commanding the border army, the two swords on his back had been stained with the blood of countless experts. But at this time, this famous Qin general did not draw his sword, but pushed his palms forward. Two hurricanes formed in front of him and pushed against Lian Bo. Lian Bo screamed and flew up. In the next moment, he became a black in the sky. At this moment, there was another black in the sky. It was his dark green greatsword. After the sword was sent flying, it did not fall. Instead, it flew high into the sky. At this moment, Lian Bo reached out and caught the sword. An ear-piercing shriek resounded in the air. The two black spots expanded rapidly in Zhao Yi's eyes. Zhao Yi's expression became extremely solemn. He could feel the chi of heaven and earth converging into the two black spots. His eyes narrowed. Then, he gripped his black greatsword with both hands and swung it upwards like a giant hammer. In the next moment, a ring-shaped airwave appeared around his body and exploded outwards. All of the flames around his body disappeared. Some of the pitch-black poplar trees standing tall in the burning reeds were instantly turned into sawdust and drifted outwards. Countless chunks of soil were sent flying in all directions by the terrifying shockwave. There was a huge pit on the shore. Through the dust, two figures gradually appeared at the bottom of the pit. Zhao Yi still gripped the black greatsword with both hands. The black greatsword was slightly bent. Before the Zhao sword furnace was destroyed, most of the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace spent their entire lives forging. The sword nucleus of the Zhao sword furnace was recognized as the best in the world. Zhao Yi was the first disciple of the Zhao sword furnace. His sword nucleus was not something ordinary people could imagine. But now his sword was bent. It could be seen what kind of power just now's attack contained. Lian Bo still held the sword in his right hand, but his entire arm was strangely twisted and hanging down. Blood seeped out of his mouth, and his face was exceptionally pale. Clearly, in this attack, the bones in his right arm had been broken in many places. The world knows Zhao Si is strong, but I had not expected you to be so strong. Lian Bo held the sword with his left hand. He looked at where Bai Shanshui's figure had disappeared. Blood stopped flowing from his mouth, but as he spoke, the energy in his chest hissed. He looked hatefully at Zhao Yi and laughed harshly. Does the Zhao sword furnace feel it is worth it to use your life to exchange for Bai Shanshui's? Zhao Yi also sensed something at this time and slowly turned around. On the distant shore, a figure was walking over. That figure was extremely thin and tall, like a turret in Chongling. I was wondering who it was. I think it is only that traitor Xinxian, and only a Realm 7 like him who hides in the sewers and eats corpses like a rat would not attract too much attention and come here. Zhao Yi knew who the newcomer was. He also understood that Lian Bo was just trying to delay him. Under the combined efforts of these two people, he had no chance of victory. Yet his brow showed a feeling of growing stronger with each defeat, just like when Zhao Miao's life-bond sword had been destroyed. My fate is in my own hands, not the heavens. He said these words. As he said this, the extremely thin and tall figure in the distance, as tall as a turret, released a terrifying sword intent. The dark presence on his body suddenly dissipated. Light came down and plated his body with layers of gold, like a demon or a saint. At the same time, there seemed to be an invisible bridge in the sky, or a gap in space. Ordinary cultivators would move large amounts of primal energies of the universe from far away that were suitable for them. But at this time, he did the opposite. He sent the sword energies formed from his own energy through this invisible bridge. The light above Zhao Yi's head grew brighter, so bright that Zhao Yi's body turned white as though he was about to melt. Zhao Yi had previously said, "My fate is in my own hands, not the heavens." He naturally knew where the true threat came from. But at this time, he did not care about the swords of light falling from the sky and seriously attacked Lian Bo. After traveling the world with Zhao Miao these years, he had comprehended the principle of retreat. But the people of the Zhao sword furnace, even if they retreated, they would advance in order to retreat. The slightly curved sword smashed down again like a hammer. When a blacksmith struck, he had to smash everything with his hammer. The power of the hammer was the sublimation of the blacksmith's life. Many people couldn't imagine how a blacksmith could smash a hammer that far exceeded his own strength. This was the reason why many people couldn't imagine how a blacksmith could smash a hammer that far exceeded his own strength. A muffled sound. The deep hole continued to sink. Lian Bo's left arm, and even his body gave off the sound of bones cracking. Lian Bo roared. The hatred and obsession he had accumulated over the years allowed him to stand with incomparable strength. The ground beneath his feet split open, and two streams of water gushed out, supporting his body and his sword. However, at this moment, the small sword that was black to the point of being red also attacked. The black-red sword was like a small hammer used by an old master in a blacksmith shop. It was only used to regulate the shape of the red iron that was being struck, but this hammer was the one that could determine the shape of the red iron. Lian Bo's inky green sword hit this small sword, but the inky green long sword in his hand vibrated. This shock wave spread to his body, shattering the primordial chi in his body. Lian Bo slumped to the ground. The powerful force pushed him backwards, and the curve of the bottom of the crater caused his body to slide backwards. When he left the crater, he was thrown upwards. Zhao Yi's figure did not stop and charged forward. He did not look at Lian Bo's figure, because he had closed his eyes. The light coming down from the sky grew brighter. Sword energy like threads of light stabbed into his body. He gave a muffled grunt. All the vital energy in his energy turned into true fire and burned fiercely. These sword energies were burned away in his body. But at the same time, the energies of his body evaporated and his body dried up. The tall and thin figure in the distance shouted in anger. The threads of light that stabbed into Zhao Yi's eyes grew brighter, and the light in the sky suddenly disappeared. The water in Zhao Yi's eyes evaporated. His veins dried up and broke, like they had turned into grains of sand. Zhao Yi's vision darkened. He knew that he would no longer be able to see any light or color. However, his withered face became even more tenacious. He swung the black greatsword in his hand backward. The large black sword howled in the wind, like an enormous stone thrown by a catapult, and fell towards the tall and thin figure in the distance. His body used the recoil of this blow to disappear into the plains on the river shore in a few leaps. Shun Xian reached forward and grabbed. With a metallic clang, his 5 fingers turned bronze as he gently grasped the tip of the black greatsword. Li Daozhou landed behind Lian Bo and supported the falling Lian Bo with his hands. In this battle, Bai Shanshui was seriously injured. Zhao Yi's eyes were blinded, and he lost a sword, but even such a situation had not been able to kill these great rebels. At this time, this famous Qin dynasty general did not feel any joy, and his entire body trembled uncontrollably. Shen Xian did not communicate with Lian Bo and his 2 remaining subordinates. He held Zhao Yi's large sword and turned to look in the direction of Chongling's imperial city. The crisscrossing streets of Chongling looked like a square chessboard in his eyes. Even if these great rebels had managed to escape this battle, they had all lost their feathers. But in the following long period of time, these great rebels could only fight for a chance to live. The Yuanwu Emperor had achieved what he wanted. The Deer Mountain Conference was completely peaceful. In the hustle and bustle, the cultivators above the 7th realm were like chess pieces. Could sword arts be stronger than mental arts? Chapter 164. The bright moon rose from the tide, and the spring river connected to the sea. When the moon was high in the sky, the Yuanwu Emperor, who liked to wear cloth robes in the Qin dynasty's imperial palace, walked out of the imperial study and stepped onto the stargazing platform. Seeing the stargazing historian record, a demon star fell into the Wei River, deep red. Fearing inauspiciousness, he picked up his brush and changed it. Yuanwu Year 12 Spring. A lucky star comes to court, auspicious signs come from the heavens, and everything is appropriate. The moon was not full, and only lacked a corner. But as he stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the moon, he had a satisfied expression. How could there be complete perfection in the world? How could there be perfection? Even if those great rebels had not been killed, even if someone wanted to use the situation to kill Fu Su, he had achieved what he needed. From the beginning to the end of the Deer Mountain Conference, Chongling would be completely peaceful, and the Qin dynasty would advance steadily. As to those pawns, sometimes the pawns were only valuable if they were alive. The strongest emperor was not unparalleled in killing, but could play an unparalleled game. Different ideas meant different realms. What he cared about was not the moves of ordinary cultivators or the victories and losses, but the entire world. At the same time, A caravan that looked like a merchant caravan was traveling on the official road. In this caravan that was 2 days away from Chongling, Li Lingjun, whose hair had been dyed black by medicine, was looking at the moon with a missing corner through the curtain. Li Lingjun's establishment in Chongling looked no different than usual. Even his study was lit, but no one knew that he had officially stepped onto the path to return home. Fish Market, on the other hand, was bustling with activity. Many people swayed under the canopies like ghosts. The hunchbacked old man holding the black bamboo staff looked at the red-robed woman sitting in front of the zither with a calm expression. He pleaded, "Eldest miss, you must leave Chongling. This is not just your idea. The uncles in court also have the same idea, right?" The red-robed woman looked at him and asked softly. The hunchbacked old man nodded and said, "The reason we are able to stay in Chongling is because the Yuanwu Emperor knows that we stand aloof from worldly affairs and only ask for a place to stay. But since he has moved against us, this means he wants Fish Market to change. This time, it's just a reminder for the sake of those uncles in the imperial court." The red-robed woman nodded and sighed. She said softly, "Even so, I was born in Chongling. Even if I die, I will stay in Chongling to see things clearly. If Yi Sealing does not leave, how can I leave?" The hunchbacked old man's eyes darkened slightly, and he wanted to say something to persuade him. Yet the woman in red said softly, "Other people do not know, but we immediately checked Song Shinshu's body that day. It should be the 9-death silkworm. Fourth Mr. Zhao's sword is broken, and Bai Shanshui is seriously injured. Even if the two of them can escape, the Yuanwu Emperor will be able to do as he wishes at the Deer Mountain Conference, and will not care about an orphan like me." The hunchbacked old man took a deep breath and finally stopped talking. Fang Shumu was also looking at the moon. He was standing on the rock in the river where Zhao Si had stood and Yi Sealing had sat. In the river water before his eyes, the moon that was missing a corner and not very complete was reflected. In his mind, there was also an incomplete moon. The river water slammed against the rock under his feet and created thousands of waves. While he had not fallen into this situation and had not been able to see the astounding battle that had occurred here with his own eyes, he could imagine the scene of the battle just from some of the minute traces and the minute changes in the primal energies of the universe. Meteors and fire fell from the sky. The river water was cut off. The sky one water shattered the cold pool. In the end, the scene that was fixed in his mind was Yi Sealing walking tiredly to this place and sitting on the rock under his feet. Why could Bai Shanshui and Zhao Yi act so freely and fight? Why did Yi Sealing dare to appear in front of these two people? Why did he stay in Chongling? He looked at the incomplete moon swaying in the river water and felt that compared to these people, he was missing something important. Previously, the holy will could not be disobeyed. His breakthrough had been lacking a bit of spring. At this time, sensing the presence left behind by these 3 wonderful women, he started to have an epiphany. Whether he could find the missing bit or not depended entirely on himself. What he lacked was not maturity, but restraint and boldness. "Take off your clothes and go." Suddenly, a Buddhist hymn sounded in his mind. The worry in his brow immediately disappeared. An indescribable joyful smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. He took off all the clothes on his body and jumped into the river barefoot. In the black river water, he laughed as the water washed his body and moved further and further away from Chongling. This was the strongest sword essence he had formed so far. It cut off all his ties to Fangho Province, Chongling, the imperial palace, and this dynasty. On this night, some people stayed and some left. In the grand scheme of the most powerful Qin emperor in history on the star observation platform, the first accident finally occurred. Fang Shumu did not become a powerful sword he took to the Deer Mountain Conference and chose to leave. Baiting Bai Shanshui into Fish Market, Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui fought. If Zhao Si wanted to take revenge for Zhao Zhan, Lian Bo, Shen Xian, and the others would have set up an ambush. Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui, and even Zhao Yi would have died. Such a grand move. In the wine shop of Falling Parasol, Ding Ning was not looking at the moon, but at Zhongsun Qianxue's face that was even prettier than the full moon. Shen Yi was an important person in Guangzhong and naturally had many sources of information. Two-level tower had many ways of gathering information. Fish market was not far from falling parasol, and Zhongsun Qianxue had sensed many presences. So this astounding situation gradually became clear in Ding Ning's mind. There is the presence of the Tin Mountain Sword Box. Zhongsun Qianxue did not need to think to know that her killing Fanjue had coincidentally ignited the fuse of this situation. She frowned slightly and said, "This is the seal soldier Li Lingjun used to settle down. It has almost realm 7 second-class power. What benefits did the Yuanwu Emperor promise him for him to hand over this item?" Ding Ning sneered and said, "Of course, to allow him to return to Chu." Zhongsun Qianxue said, "Will the price be too great?" Ding Ning glanced at her and said, "There are many people in the Chu dynasty who do not want him to return. The price to ensure his safe return to Chu is not great." Zhongsun Qianxue frowned and said, "I am not saying that the price he gave is too great. I am saying that the Tin Mountain Sword Box in exchange for returning to Chu, the price the Qin dynasty gave, is too great. You feel that Li Lingjun is outstanding and fear that the enemy country after the Qin dynasty will have another young and powerful emperor?" Ding Ning coldly shook his head. In terms of scheming, Li Lingjun and Zheng Xiu are far from each other. Since Zheng Xiu has him return, it means that she never thought that Li Lingjun was a match for her. Or rather, she had absolute control over this matter. In the battle of the third year of Yuanwu, 200,000 of our army were killed, countless chariots were lost, and Yangshan commandery was cut off. One sun for 600 miles. This is a great humiliation. So watch carefully. In this Deer Mountain Conference, the Yuanwu Emperor's primary target is the Chu dynasty. After this Deer Mountain Conference, if nothing unexpected happens, Yangshan commandery will be returned. In the future, if we want to destroy enemy countries, the first to be destroyed will be the Chu dynasty. After a pause, Ding Ning sneered and said, "Compared to killing by Shan Shui and Zhao Si, having Li Lingjun return to Chu is the most important matter in this situation. Li Lingjun is outstanding, but he has stayed in Chongling for too long. After staying in Chongling for too long, everyone knows too much about him." Zhongsun Qianxue's expression grew more displeased. She did not like complicated matters, and she disliked people with complicated minds even more. Also, she had never liked Zheng Xiu. "I remember that child's presence." A rare hint of coldness flowed through her eyes as she said slowly. The words were sudden, but Ding Ning completely understood. He was silent for a moment and said, "I know he should be Fu Su. Who wants to kill him?" She asked after a moment of silence. "Someone wants to use this situation to kill Fu Su. People who can do something like this will not be ordinary nobility. But the two ministers? The nobility behind the other imperial princes, and even Zheng Xiu, are possible." Ding Ning shook his head and looked at her. He said, "The fights in the court are the most complicated, just like the fights between wives and concubines of rich families." Zhongsun Qianxue frowned and said in a cold voice, "Zheng Xiu is also possible? Why would she want to kill her son? Maybe it is just for show. Even if I do not attack with my full power, she will be prepared?" Ding Ning said coldly, "Maybe it is another trap to make people feel that someone else is plotting this." This kind of palace fight was too complicated. Zhongsun Qianxue finally lost interest in thinking. She closed her eyes and started to cultivate. Yet, she was like the moon missing a corner, unable to reach perfection. She could not calm her mind and look inside. She opened her eyes again and looked at Ding Ning. She asked, "Is he that person's son?" Ding Ning looked at her eyes and shook his head with certainty.
"No."
Zhongsun Qianxue did not say anything else and closed her eyes. For some reason, the frost on her face was thicker than usual. Ding Ning also closed his eyes. At the same time, he thought inside, but maybe I can make the emperor feel that he is. Chapter 165. In the morning of falling parasol, The noodle shop owner looked dazedly at the many busy masons and carpenters. The government had clearly registered the losses yesterday and paid some silver as compensation. But this morning, another group of people started to repair the destroyed houses near Falling Parasol. Just from the materials they used, the rebuilt houses would be much better than the original. Large amounts of wood and bricks took up most of the road, making it difficult for carriages to pass. A man dressed in cotton robes got off the carriage and slowly walked around the junk towards the wine shop and the small courtyard where Shui Wangsu was. Zhang Yi happened to be at the door pouring water for washing his face. Seeing this man, Zhang Yi immediately put down the basin in his hand, wiped his hands, and bowed. Mr. Wang Taishu. Sensing the presence of the approaching man, Zhang Yi was stunned. He congratulated in admiration. "Congratulations to Mr. on your breakthrough." This man was Wang Taishu. It seemed that he was still as thin and weak as before, as if he could not even stand up to a gust of wind. However, his complexion was not as pale as before, and there was a faint layer of light flickering on his face. In Zhang Yi's perception, there seemed to be another world in Wang Taishu's body. It was as empty as a valley, but contained great power that could erupt at any time. This stark difference caused him to understand that Wang Taishu had broken through from Realm 5 to Realm 6. He also seemed to have merged with his life bond item and started to cultivate his life bond sword. Wang Taishu was a cultivator from the streets and had reached Realm 6 in the prime of his life. Zhang Yi was impressed by this cultivation speed. Hearing Zhang Yi's congratulations, Wang Taishu smiled and returned the greeting. Ding Ning walked out of the small courtyard and glanced at Wang Taishu. He said half-jokingly and half-seriously, "You are finally not too weak." Wang Taishu looked seriously at him and said, "If you had not given me some whale jade ointment, maybe I would still be very weak now." Zhang Yi was stunned. Only now did he know that Ding Ning had given some of the precious whale jade ointment the vice bureau chief of the Bureau of Ceremonies had given to Wang Taishu. "Have you found the origins of those death warriors?" However, Ding Ning did not take it seriously. He directly changed the topic and asked calmly. Since those death warriors were used to assassinate Fu Su, the person behind the scenes would not allow people to find the connection between them and the true mastermind. But the gangsters of Chongling had different methods than the government. They could find the tracks these people had left in the streets of Chongling. They are not outsiders. They have stayed in Chongling for more than 2 years. Wang Taishu looked at him and said, "But in the last 2 years, they did not even show their cultivator identities. 2 of them even have families in Chongling. Even their wives and children do not know of their cultivator identities." Ding Ning said, "They are well hidden." Wang Taishu glanced at him and said, "Can we speak alone?" Ding Ning frowned. There were no outsiders here. If Wang Taishu said so, there must be something important.
All right.
He nodded and turned to walk towards the wine shop. After Wang Taishu walked into the wine shop, he closed the door. Then he said in a voice only he and Ding Ning could hear, "There is something I want to hear your opinion on." Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "What kind of important matter is it that makes you so cautious? If you have something to say it all at once. Otherwise, I will die from anxiety." "It really is an extremely important matter," Wang Taishu said softly. "It should be Zhao Si." Ding Ning's expression froze slightly. He immediately reacted and said cautiously, "You found her tracks?" Wang Taishu nodded slowly and said softly, "After the battle outside Fish Market, she did not flee towards the mountains and wilderness outside Chongling. She returned to Chongling and booked a room at Spring Wind Restaurant. Spring Wind Restaurant happens to be one of our businesses. The female owner of the restaurant does not have any strong points, but she used to be a palace attendant in the palace. Men, women, and even eunuchs can be seen at a glance from their different auras and actions. That person was clearly a woman, but she had rented an entire room. It was very strange, so I naturally went to take a look. However, even I could only confirm that she was a cultivator. I couldn't even sense her cultivation level. I had just reached the natal realm, so I could vaguely sense that her natal qi was unstable. Adding on the rumors, I think it is most likely Zhao Si." Ding Ning took a deep breath. Many people in Chongling knew that after the battle on the Wei River, by Shanshui, Zhao Si, and Zhao Yi had fled with serious injuries. Zhao Yi had lost a sword, and Zhao Si's life-bond sword had been destroyed. She would be hunted down by powerful cultivators of the Qin dynasty, and her fate was unknown. But who would have thought that after suffering such serious injuries, Zhao Si would hide in Chongling? This is truly seeking life and death. The people of the Zhao sword furnace do not care about their lives. Ding Ning slowly exhaled the cold air in his lungs. He looked at Wang Taishu and said, Zhao Si cannot die, you cannot use her to exchange for some benefits. The Zhao sword furnace still has people. If something happens to her in your territory, no one in 2-level tower may survive. What I want is to do nothing and pretend I have not discovered her identity. Wang Taishu looked at Ding Ning and said softly. Ding Ning shook his head and said, this is an opportunity. Wang Taishu frowned and asked humbly, what do you mean? Bai Shanshui entered Fish Market, and Zhao Si appeared. Even we will feel that the people of the Zhao sword furnace are connected to Fish Market. The people who set up that trap may know more about certain things. Since Zhao Si has interactions with the gangsters of Fish Market, they will naturally feel that Zhao Si may have interactions with other gangsters. Ding Ning narrowed his eyes slightly and said slowly, if you did not help to conceal it, I fear that Zhao Si would have been quickly discovered. At that time, you will think you have no problems with her, but those important people may not think so. After a pause, Ding Ning looked up into Wang Taishu's eyes and said, as to Zhao Si, she should know that you are the most resourceful person in Chongling right now, so she may not have gone to Spring Wind Pavilion with the thought of hiding. Wang Taishu thought carefully for a long time and said with a grimace, this is a hot potato. It's a hot potato. Ding Ning looked at him and said calmly, but the hot potato can be eaten. Send Jing Mazong in front of her as an exchange. Wang Taishu stilled slightly. Jing Mazong? Ding Ning glanced at him and said, great rebels cannot be planned for long, especially people like the Zhao sword furnace whose lives are hanging on the tip of the sword. You cannot have a long relationship with them. To them, taking in another disciple, especially one who is very suitable for their way of the sword, was something they would not refuse. As long as it was a disciple of the Zhao sword furnace, they would naturally be a great enemy in Great Qin's eyes. They would naturally be happy to create another great enemy for Great Qin. In order to settle down in Chongling, it does not depend on how useful you are to those important people, but how many strong swords you have. So protect Zhao Si from death, and have her raise a sword for you. Wang Taishu said, you are certain Jing Mazong is suitable? Ding Ning said seriously, I have fought with him before. I am certain he is suitable. As to talent, supposedly, more than half of the disciples of the Zhao sword furnace are stubborn iron with poor talent. This is one of the reasons that the great grandmaster of the Zhao sword furnace is revered by the world. That great grandmaster gave his legacy to Zhao Si, and even Zhao Yi was given to Zhao Si to teach. Zhao Si naturally has the ability to forge stubborn iron. Wang Taishu made his decision and relaxed. He started to admire Zhao Si. He couldn't help but shake his head and say softly, no one had expected the famed fourth Mr. Zhao to be a woman and have such courage. Ding Ning said calmly, you were chosen by her. This means your courage is not bad. Wang Taishu grimaced and said, other people do not know, but you gave me half of my courage. Ding Ning's expression was still absolutely calm, but his breathing grew slightly hot. This was an accident he had not expected at all. The sword of the Zhao sword furnace would form a connection with him through this kind of method. As long as there was a connection, he could take advantage of it. A young man of few words was walking through the streets. He was wearing an exceptionally thick fur coat, and it was not the commonly seen fox or deerskin, but the fur of the snowy plains wolf, which was produced in a very cold place. Although this kind of fur was fluffy, it wasn't soft at all. It gave off an exceptionally strong feeling. In Chongling's weather right now, there were very few people who wore such thick clothing. For ordinary people, people who wore especially thick clothing were more afraid of the cold than ordinary people. Most of them came from places where the 4 seasons were as warm as spring. But in reality, many people who came from extremely cold places were more afraid of the cold. Their fear of the cold was like a habit, a kind of psychological coldness. Because in the space they usually moved in, they were likely to encounter extremely harsh environments. So the constant threat of death forced them to be more careful, and forced them to form the habit of being as warm as possible. This youth was like this. His gaze was dark and cold. Adding on the thick fur on his body, he looked like a wolf walking on its hind legs. Li Shixing, are you going to deal with that youth from the falling parasol wine shop? Suddenly, a voice sounded from a nearby carriage. Chapter 166. The taciturn youth had already smelled something strange from this carriage, but when he suddenly heard this kind of sound, he was a bit unaccustomed, to the extent that his reaction was a bit slow. It had been many years since he had heard someone call his name like this. That voice was young and somewhat familiar. It could only be one of his childhood playmates who knew his intentions. However, he only had the worst memories of his childhood playmates. In his memories, these people could only be considered as enemies. It was only because they were too young that they were forced into a group. Who is it? Therefore, he only raised his head and asked in an extremely cold tone. Back then, I fought with you once. You can't even recognize my voice? Meng Qihai, dressed in ordinary robes, and Li Shixing walked out of the carriage. Meng Qihai looked provocatively at Li Shixing and smiled. His appearance had changed greatly from when he was young. Li Shixing looked at Meng Qihai's expression and then heard the words. He finally remembered and sneered. I was wondering who it was. So it is the boy of the Meng Marquisate establishment. Meng Qihai said with slight disdain. What? You drank too much of Yueji's inferior wine, and your tone is even worse than before. Li Shixing was silent for a moment and said coldly, then according to your words, I suffered at your hands and was exiled to Yueji. So I had to change my personality and come back. Facing your disdain, I had to flatter you with a smile? Meng Qihai frowned. It seems it is hard to change your personality. Li Shixing, back then, Duanmu Jingzong was a year younger than you. You were 6, he was 5. What did he know? Even if he pulled out 2 of your saplings, you could have just beaten him. But you broke 2 of his ribs. Do you not feel this is too cruel? In these years, everyone has grown up. Logically, you should understand some things better than before. Do you still feel that you were right in the past? Have you not thought that it was everyone's fault that everyone did not like you back then? Li Shixing suddenly grew angry and said gravely, You did not like me because you were afraid of me. Meng Qihai sneered and asked in return, Afraid of you? Li Shixing also sneered. Because I'm better than you in everything. Reading, writing, archery, swordsmanship, body tempering, and even hunting and growing herbs. I'm much better than you. None of you can defeat me, so of course you're afraid of me. Meng Qihai's expression became stern, but before he could speak, Li Shixing's expression recovered its coldness. He said, Just like now, you cannot defeat me. So, do not think about teaching me a lesson. If you need to leave, leave. Otherwise, why do you think I returned to Chongling? You must be very strong, and have performed well enough to enter a first-rate sect in Chongling to study. Otherwise, it would be a waste of a talented young cultivator. Fu Su pulled at Meng Qihai, who was about to explode, and said gently, But everyone has their own strengths. Some are skilled in fighting, some are skilled in reading, calligraphy, and painting, some are skilled in understanding. Li Shixing, have you ever thought that your playmates in the past were not as good as you in every aspect because they did not understand, did not feel those things were important, and did not spend much effort on them? Of course. Hearing Fu Su's words, Meng Qihai laughed coldly. Children find it hard to support a small tree. Everyone wants to eat candied haws one moment and fly the next. Flying a kite, who would want to compete with planting a tree? Who would feel that one needs to work hard and spend effort on these things? Li Shixing unconsciously frowned. He looked at Fu Su and started to feel this person was familiar. Sometimes, when the time is wrong and the target is wrong, it is naturally wrong. Fu Su looked at Li Shixing and said gently, While I did not have much contact with you when I was young, I thought of how you went to the desolate lands for so many years because of your childhood mistake. I felt that I was too harsh on you. Everyone felt apologetic and hoped that you could change your personality when you came back. Maybe we'll find that everyone is happy to be friends with you. So, it is Prince Fu Su. Li Shixing finally sensed who this person was. His expression grew stern as he bowed. Fu Su nodded in return and said with a smile, "If you do not refuse, I can call my childhood playmates for a gathering." Li Shixing was silent for a moment. He shook his head and said, "Many thanks for Prince Fu Su's good intentions. But you are right. Everyone has their strengths. Some people are suited to making friends, while others are not. I think I am a battle general suited to fighting on the battlefield, but I have never been able to make friends. It is easy to make enemies if I interact too much." Hearing the clear conflict in the other's words, Fu Su did not insist. He said gently, "You just came back and may not be used to many things. You can stay for a while longer." But this youth from Falling Parasol, he hesitated slightly and said, "He helped me once, so I hope that you will not make trouble for him." Li Shixing bowed slightly again and said, "Since this is your intention, my father will listen. Before the Min Mountain Sword trials, I will not appear here. But according to my father's intentions, I will attend the Min Mountain Sword trials. If we happen to encounter each other during the Min Mountain Sword trials, I will not be merciful." Fu Su smiled gratefully and said, "If we happen to encounter each other, they will all be future pillars of our dynasty. If we can be merciful, we will be merciful." Li Shixing made a sound of acknowledgement and did not say more. He bid farewell and left. Meng Qihai frowned as he looked at Li Shixing's back. He said, "It seems he has gotten worse." Fu Su said calmly, "All outstanding people have strange tempers." Meng Qihai said with slight disdain, "Because the stranger a person is, the easier it is for them to walk the same path to the end?" Fu Su thought and said, "You can say that. The stranger a person is, the harder it is for them to be influenced by others, and the more they will persist in their own thoughts. Everyone has their own uses." His father also has a similar temper. Although most people don't like him when it comes to marching and fighting, there are really not many people who can match him. Yes, in any case, they do not care if other people like them. Meng Qihai glanced at Fu Su and said, "Let's not talk about him. Have you thought of a way to become friends with that wine shop youth?" It was simple for Fu Su to help Ding Ning block Li Shixing, but he did not know how to disguise his identity and get close to Ding Ning. The reason he was lonely in the Imperial Palace was because he had no friends. In his world, friends were a very strange thing. He had no experience with them at all. Since his family sells wine, then let's go drink a few more times. We should be able to become friends, right? Later, I will go in alone. You have seen him. He should have an impression of you." After a while, Fu Su finally thought of a method he thought was feasible. "You really do not have many similarities with him." In the wine shop, sensing the approach of the two youths, Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at Ding Ning, who had returned to the wine shop, and said coldly, "Even if he has the ability to strategize and win battles from 1,000 miles away, he will not use his friends." "So he died at the hands of his friends," Ding Ning said quietly. "So one cannot be too pedantic." Zhang Sun Qianxue could not help but be angry because she felt this was not that person's fault. If he wasn't too pedantic, if he wasn't a man of his word, if he wasn't a man of his word, if he wasn't so trusting, if he had changed earlier, perhaps he would have been able to see through people earlier. He wouldn't have made so many mistakes, and he would definitely have chosen to be with you long ago. So I do not blame him. I just hope that you do not blame him too much." Yet Ding Ning's next words caused her to become silent. "What is the use in blaming him or not?" Zhang Sun Qianxue said coldly after a dozen breaths. At this time, footsteps sounded, and Fu Su's figure appeared in their sight. Ding Ning glanced at Fu Su like he was an ordinary wine customer. But he used a voice that only he and Zhang Sun Qianxue could hear to ask softly, "Do you think they look alike?" Zhang Sun Qianxue also glanced at Fu Su and said coldly, "I can only see that horse features." Ding Ning took a deep breath and said slowly in a low voice, "You should remember that person's face clearly. If Fu Su comes often, you should be able to make him look more like that person." Zhang Sun Qianxue turned around and said, "Is it useful?" "Useful," Ding Ning said seriously and confidently. "You will not notice minute changes if you look at the same person every day. But after many days, the person in other people's eyes will be different." Zhang Sun Qianxue said, "I am not talking about this. I am saying that the Yuanwu Emperor will not believe that Hor, because of this." "Good preparation," Ding Ning said. "Sometimes, a complete change just needs an opportunity," Zhang Sun Qianxue said with disdain. "So vicious." Ding Ning said, "I know you hate doing things like this, but you must help me because you see things simply. You only need to consider cultivation. For you, as long as your cultivation surpasses the Yuanwu Emperor, you can kill him. But you should know that the Yuanwu Emperor is not an ordinary cultivator. In your mind, you only need to fight him, but I need to fight an entire dynasty." Zhang Sun Qianxue did not say anything else and walked into the backyard. In her and Ding Ning's world, this meant tacit agreement. "You want to buy wine?" Ding Ning looked up at Fu Su, who was slightly restrained as he walked into the wine shop, and asked slowly, "My physical book of Ice and Fire Destruction God is about to appear on the market. Those interested can join the group 3098214748 and immediately learn of the latest information and activities of the physical book." Chapter 167. Fu Su's eyes lit up. He nodded and said, "I heard that the wine here and Little Boss are very famous, so I came to try." Looking at Fu Su's clean and gentle features, Ding Ning's body seemed to be filled with countless scenes. These scenes were like sand and stone that turned his body cold and hard. At the same time, they made it difficult for him to breathe. They were all the earthy scents that left the deepest impression in his mind. What he truly wants is longevity, to rule the Qin dynasty forever, or rather, the entire world. So everyone is his tool. You and Jing Xiao are not an exception. I want to take back the debts he owes many people. At the same time, I hope to change many people's fates, including yours. As what I owe you, I will do my best to give you the ability to make your own choices in the future." Ding Ning took a deep breath and retreated the scenes in his mind.
What?
Ding Ning's moment of silence caused Fu Su to become slightly nervous. He feared that his words were inappropriate. "You have seen me before?" Ding Ning looked at him and asked. Fu Su suddenly panicked and instinctively waved his hand.
No.
But he was not skilled at lying, or rather, he had never lied before. As he waved his hand, 2 red clouds appeared on his face. "I don't think I have seen you before." Ding Ning looked calmly at him and said, "But I feel you are familiar. So, I think this is what it means to feel like old friends at first sight." Ding Ning's words contained many meanings, but Fu Su's panic completely disappeared. He felt joy. He could not help but laugh and said, "I also feel like old friends at first sight. Since that is the case, today's wine is on me," Ding Ning said as he put a pot of wine on the table in front of Fu Su. Fu Su's eyes grew brighter. He hurriedly picked up a wine cup, poured a cup of wine, raised it in a toast, and then drank it all in one gulp. The wine tasted sour in his mouth. His brow immediately furrowed. This wine, but he could not help but laugh. "This wine is so unique. May we meet again?" Ding Ning poured a cup of wine. Like ordinary people in Chongling, he raised his cup in a toast. But when he drank it all, he said inside, "To our fate." Fu Su's alcohol tolerance was not very good. At this time, he naturally did not need to use his true essence to force out the alcohol in his body. Soon his eyes were hazy. His status was extremely noble, and his heart was restrained. Although he was happy, he restrained himself from drinking. Zhang Sun Qianxue walked out of the inner courtyard with a pot of hot tea. She looked at Fu Su's clean brows and eyes. The more she looked, the more they resembled Jing Xiao. For no reason she felt hatred. Where should I start? That person's face appeared in her mind, and it was as clear as yesterday. A minuscule thread of energy came out of her fingertip and touched Fu Su's face along with the steam from the hot tea. Why are you drinking so much when you can't drink? Aren't you afraid of spouting nonsense after drinking? Waiting in the carriage outside falling parasol, Meng Qihai finally heard Fu Su's footsteps. He saw Fu Su's face lift the curtain and couldn't help but complain. He did not see anything unusual. While Meng Qihai was complaining about Fu Su, in the study deep in the Qin dynasty's imperial palace that had multiple spirit lotuses that had already formed seed heads, the empress fingers were entwined with multiple threads of pure light. In the battle on the Wei River, all the cultivators above Realm 7 in Chongling could feel her attack. They could feel that Zhao Ci's life-bond sword had been destroyed in her hands. The thin and continuous streams of vital energy and primal energies of the universe that came out of her study pierced into the sky with great determination. They reached a place they could not sense and caused the star fire to turn into great power. All the cultivators of Chongling were certain that after so many years, the sword of hellfire, Zheng Xiao, who had often killed enemy generals on the battlefield with one blow, was stronger than before. At this time, she was still channeling the primal energies of the universe from her body into the sky, into the cold space where the primal energies of the universe had completely disappeared. She was controlling the unique cold flames formed from comet dust and star fire. But at this time, none of the cultivators of Chongling, including the emperor in the imperial palace who had taken care of some hidden dangers before the Deer Mountain Conference and was cultivating in seclusion in the last moments before the conference, could sense her actions. Because the Bazin Kendo ground had been destroyed. Because even in the Bazin Kendo ground back then, she was the only one who had comprehended and cultivated this cultivation method. She was like a small star that gave off starlight in an unknown place and passed through endless space. Inside the pale flames that she controlled with starlight was a small sword that was as black as rust. This small sword was naturally Zhao Ci's life-bond sword. After this little sword was defeated by her and its connection with Zhao Ci was severed, logically speaking, it should have fallen to some unknown place. But at this moment, she did not know why. The threads of power in the pale white flames seemed to be nourishing this already dead sword. Someone passed by the stone path filled with terracotta soldiers outside her study and walked towards her study. Her flawless features did not change. The threads of light around her hand slowly turned into dozens of dots of light and disappeared. A yellow-robed cultivator of her family appeared at the door of her study and handed a secret letter to the palace attendant at the door. Opening the secret letter the palace maid handed over, her face showed some satisfaction. To be able to make demon consort Zhao change her mind, he does have some talent. Arrange for him to go to the inn. There should be room for him to show off. The yellow-robed cultivator did not dare to look up and bowed slightly. Hearing her words, the yellow-robed cultivator respectfully acknowledged and then asked, "The family wants to know your opinion of Fang Xiumu. Not useful, of course he will be killed." She shook her head and said, "The Holy One will naturally choose a replacement. Tell the family not to think of making a fuss about this matter." The Empress' features were flawless, but her eyes were as cold as the Wei River. In the water of the Wei River, a white figure moved like a water immortal through the flickering light and passing shadows. She did not need to come out of the water to breathe and could move at such an astounding speed underwater. She was naturally Bai Shanshui. The water was the safest place for her to escape. After using Zhao Yi's power to escape the pursuit of Lian Bo and the others, she returned to the Wei River. But she knew the danger had not passed, so she could not relax. At this time, she finally saw the clear water line in front of her. Behind the bright water was a deep color and astoundingly vast world. She knew she had heard of the Wei River and was in the deep sea. Here, she was like a serpent coming out of the sea. No one could kill her. Her heart relaxed slightly, and the strange blush on her face completely disappeared. A mouthful of blood spurted out from her mouth. The iron-filled frustration in her chest finally lessened slightly. But her expression suddenly changed. A wave of coldness caused her body to unconsciously tremble. The medicinal power of the Dan pill that had helped her suppress her injuries was too strong. She had forcefully channeled her vital energy for too long this time. Right now, her entire energy sea was slightly unstable. The vital energy that she could circulate had actually fallen back to Realm 6. Her figure continued to move forward with the flow of the water, gradually sinking into the deep shadows. Her usually proud and aloof face rippled with a trace of indescribable bitterness. Bai Shanshui was not the only person who had lost in this battle. In reality, all the rebels of the Qin dynasty had not won many battles against the Qin dynasty in these years. So there were fewer and fewer people like her and Zhao Si. Zhao Sijing sat in a room filled with the smell of cosmetics. She watched as Jing Mazong pushed open the half-closed door and entered the room. Her eyes were still filled with the intent to pierce the heavens and kill the earth. "It seems I gambled right this time," she said self-mockingly. Then she looked coolly at Jing Mazong and asked, "Wang Taishu did not come, and had you come? What is the meaning of this?" Jing Mazong bowed deeply and said, "He wants me to learn the sword from Mr. This is his condition?" Zhao Si looked sympathetically at him and said, "To learn a sword, you must first become a sword of the Zhao sword furnace." Jing Mazong said, "Mr. Taishu has already told me, and I am not of the Qin." Zhao Si sneered. "It seems I did not underestimate his boldness. But why do you think you qualify to become a sword of the Zhao sword furnace?" Jing Mazong did not know how to answer. For him, the Zhao sword furnace was too high, so high that he could not look up to it. Zhao Si's eyes darkened. A light without any presence flowed out of her and cut towards Jing Mazong's right wrist. Jing Mazong's body shook, but he did not dodge. This light cut open the veins in his wrist. Blood slowly flowed out. The drops of blood fell to the ground with clear sounds. Zhao Si looked at him and said coolly, "If you dare to bleed to the end, I will have you become a sword of the Zhao sword furnace." Jing Mazong looked up at her and allowed the blood to flow from his hand. Zhao Si did not move as though she wanted to watch him die. Even when Jing Mazong finally could not hold on and fell to the ground and started to fall unconscious, she did not move. There was almost no blood flowing out of his wrist. When his life force started to disappear, Zhao Si took a deep breath and reached out. Dozens of drops of blood suddenly came out of her fingertips. Then they elongated in the air, turning into dozens of thin needles that entered Jing Mazong's meridians. Jing Mazong's organs felt the hope of life. Then they were stimulated by a burning sensation and moved even more vigorously. Zhao Si smiled coldly and said to herself, "I had not thought that there would be a person among the commoners who could inherit the sword essence of the Zhao sword furnace." Chapter 168. Time continued to flow. This may be the only fair thing for everyone in the world. But for many of the Chongling nobility, time in this spring seemed to flow faster than in previous years. The reason it was fast was because people were in a hurry and because of the Deer Mountain Conference. While the Min Mountain Sword Trials was a projection of countless Chongling nobility fighting and a performance of the Qin dynasty's talents that all the dynasties paid attention to, compared to the Deer Mountain Conference that could decide the fate of an entire dynasty, it could not be mentioned in the same breath. Fenghe Province in the twilight did not seem any different than in the past. But as Su Xiaomu disobeyed the emperor and left without saying goodbye, many people saw a hint of decline. In the Wei River military port, Yi Sealing stood at the bow of the enormous armored ship that had accompanied her out to sea. She looked at Fenghe Province in the distant light. Suddenly, she said softly to Han Sanshur, who had been following her like an old servant, "The one to replace Feng Xiaomu and follow the emperor to the Deer Mountain Conference must be Feng Xiang."
"Why?"
Han Sanshur asked. Her words were hard for almost everyone in Chongling to understand. It was a great honor to follow the emperor to the Deer Mountain Conference. Now that Feng Xiaomu had disobeyed the emperor, even if Fenghe Province had to make up for his mistakes and call back the mighty general guarding the pass, this action was too great. "Just wait and see." Yi Sealing shook her head and smiled coldly. She was one of the few people who understood the Yuanwu emperor the best. She knew that Fenghe Province, once the strongest of the 13 marquises, would likely be the first to turn to dust. As time passed, a beautiful mountain shrouded in mist and water appeared in front of Li Lingjuan's caravan, shrouded in the twilight. Seeing the mountain appear so clearly in front of him, like a world pressing down on him, Li Lingjuan's eyes uncontrollably became misty. That was Wu Mountain, the Chu lands. After being away from the Chu for so many years, not to mention this mountain, even the grass and trees on this mountain were exceptionally stunning. In Li Lingjuan's caravan, there were naturally many Chu people who had followed him to Chongling. The road back home was long and arduous. This road back home had been planned for more than 10 years. Along the way, there were arrangements to change the carriages and horses. It was a true day and night journey. They only used half the usual time to get here. Naturally, everyone in the caravan was exhausted to the extreme. But when they saw the mountain and the vegetation on it, all the Chu people seemed to be struck by lightning. Their bodies trembled violently, and many of them started to sob. Wushan Mountain was a natural obstacle. It was surrounded by several surging rivers, so it was impossible for an army to launch a surprise attack from here. Usually, only the border trade caravans would pass through here. Therefore, on Li Lingjuan's route back home, the last checkpoint of the Qin dynasty was the Wushan Pass, which was guarded by several hundred soldiers. The most important military base of the Qin dynasty and the Chu dynasty had originally been Yangshan Commandery. It was at the end of Wu Mountain and cut deep into the plains of the Chu dynasty. Yangshan Commandery had belonged to the Chu dynasty in the 3rd year of Yuanwu. Right now, the closest Qin stronghold to Wu Mountain Pass was Cold Valley Pass, more than 60 miles from here. From Chongling to here, there had been no obstructions. This checkpoint had clearly received the relevant secret orders. After seeing the documents of this caravan, they immediately let them pass and did not even check the people and items accompanying the caravan. When the caravan truly drove into the path that the caravan had created through the Wu Mountain, Li Lingjun could not control his emotions as he smelled the moist air of the Wu Mountain. He lifted the curtain and had an impulse to kiss the land of his homeland. However, the moment he lifted the curtains, a gray-robed old man sitting in the first carriage of the caravan suddenly opened his eyes. The clouds above the caravan suddenly began to spin, as if a true dragon was about to emerge from within. Li Lingjun and many people in the caravan froze slightly. Even as the clouds above the caravan changed color, the patch of clouds ahead remained motionless, like a rock in the water. That part of the world seemed to have become a world that belonged to someone. A middle-aged man with his hair coiled up with an exquisite white jade hairpin and dressed in indigo robes with gold patterns appeared in everyone's sight. The moment he appeared in everyone's sight, all the dust in the forest seemed to be blown away by a kind of presence and became unusually clean. Sensing the untainted presence this person gave off, Li Lingjuan's breathing paused slightly. He got off the carriage without any hesitation and bowed slightly to this person. He said, "Greetings to General Fan Wugo." Hearing Li Lingjuan's words, all the cultivators in the caravan changed expression. They knew that if this person had come to kill Li Lingjun, then even the elder in the first carriage might not be able to stop him. Fan Wugo was the master of Unsullied Palace of the Chu dynasty and one of the strongest generals of the Chu dynasty. His fame and status in the world was likely close to the masters of Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate of the Qin dynasty. Yet he had appeared here today. Do not be nervous. I am just following orders to take you to see someone. Peerless experts naturally had the demeanor of peerless experts. Fan Wugo nodded in return and spoke coolly. Then he turned and said, "Come with me alone." Li Lingjun took a deep breath and nodded at the surrounding people. The spinning clouds above the caravan quickly disappeared. He followed Fan Wugo's footsteps into a small forest path. While Fan Wugo did not have any murderous intent, his back and the presence he gave off gave Li Lingjun great pressure. After a dozen breaths, Li Lingjuan's hands were sweating slightly. "You have a virtuous reputation in Chongling, and I have paid attention to your cultivation progress. In the past many years, your cultivation progress was outstanding and surpassed almost all of my disciples. But starting from 5 years ago, your cultivation progress started to slow unusually. Otherwise, you would have reached Realm 7 when you see me now. But you have not reached Realm 7, and your energies are slightly out of balance. Since you have returned, do not worry too much. You have to understand, cultivation is the foundation of whether you can establish yourself in this world. Fan Wugo did not turn back, but spoke slowly. Li Lingjuan's expression tightened slightly, and he said sincerely, "This junior has learned." Fan Wugo did not speak more, and continued to move forward. He started to pass through some mountain forests without roads. The surroundings grew more desolate. 15 minutes later, a mountain meadow appeared in front of him and Li Lingjun. This place was not invaded by the cold even in winter. The three wall-like mountain walls completely blocked the cold wind, so the unknown ferns grew waist-high. In the center of this mountain meadow, there was a small lake. Beside the lake, there were several large tents. At this time, the lamps were lit, and they appeared unusually bright and warm. The person who wants to see you is inside. You can go by yourself. Fan Wugo stood at the edge of the meadow with his hands behind his back and said coolly to Li Lingjun. What kind of great person could be received by Fan Wugo? Li Lingjun thought of a possibility, but felt it was impossible. His breathing grew faster. He did not dare to slack off and quickly walked through the meadow like the wind. The closer he got to the tents by the lake, the more shocked Li Lingjun became. In an area dozens of feet away from the tents, the grass was neatly cleaned, and the ground was covered in precious flowers that gave off a refreshing fragrance. The bright light emitted from the tent was not from lamps, but from pearls. Even the tents themselves were made from some kind of white bee skin. Li Lingjun had never seen this kind of white bee skin before. It gave off a unique fragrance. Several maids dressed in palace attire walked out when he approached the tents. They bowed to him and then opened the curtain of one of the tents, allowing him to enter. Li Lingjuan's breathing completely stopped. These tents were connected together like they formed a deep courtyard. The inside of the tents was extremely luxurious and exquisite. It was much better than the most exquisite room in Li Lingjuan's establishment in Chongling, and could even be said to be more exquisite than all the beautiful rooms in Chongling. Such beauty could only come from the imperial palace of the Chu dynasty in the world. Everything in these tents was no different from everything in the exquisite halls of the Chu dynasty's imperial palace. In the centermost tent, a beautiful woman whose figure alone made it difficult to breathe was standing with her back to him. In front of the beautiful woman there was a hot spring pool that was either man-made or naturally formed. It was constantly emitting a misty, white mist. Li Lingjun finally confirmed that the impossible person he had guessed was possible. He bowed his head in terror, hesitated slightly, and said, "Mother Empress, when you left Qing City, you were still a child." An incomparably beautiful voice sounded. The beautiful woman slowly said with a trace of emotion, "You don't need to rush to Qing City. What you need to do is to wait with me at Deer Mountain." Li Lingjuan's breathing paused. He finally understood why this woman who was as powerful as Zheng Xiu was here. He said in a trembling voice, "Is Father King's entourage about to arrive?" The beautiful woman still did not turn around. She nodded and said, "It is about time. Come and serve me in the bath." Li Lingjuan's body uncontrollably trembled. His mind was completely blank. In the next breath, he started to understand what had happened. He finally understood what methods Su Qin had used to let him return to the Chu so smoothly. But this kind of thing, Su Qin had not told him. His mouth became dry like he had swallowed sand and stone. The beautiful woman was waiting for him. Her soft back slowly hardened because of his hesitation. Li Lingjun was filled with indescribable emotions, but he knew what he should do now. "As you command." His mind was filled with great murderous intent towards Su Qin, but his expression was as gentle as usual. He slowly walked forward, and his hands landed on the beautiful woman's shoulders. Wu Mountain was slowly shrouded in the night, and the mist grew thicker. In the hot spring pool in the tent, the sound of water seemed to be murmuring. Chapter 169. Rain silently fell, causing the entire Wu Mountain to be shrouded in mist like an immortal realm. The caravan waited silently on the muddy mountain path. Lu Sish stood by one of the carriages, silently and nervously looking in the direction Fan Wugo and Li Lingjun had left. Familiar footsteps came from the darkness. Lu Sish's expression relaxed slightly. There was no sign of Fan Wugo. Li Lingjun walked out of the forest alone, but his body gave everyone a feeling of crystallization. He seemed to have washed away the tiredness from the long journey and gave off an unusual presence. In Chongling, Li Lingjun had shown admirable abilities in many areas and a presence that made people follow him. But he had to be careful to survive. But at this time, in the eyes of everyone inside and outside the carriage, Li Lingjun's cautiousness had mostly disappeared, and his figure seemed to grow larger. This change in presence caused many people to realize something, and they became excited again. Li Lingjun knew what his loyal retainers needed right now. So he coughed softly and said in a gentle and clear voice, "We do not need to hurry to Qing City. We will go to Deer Mountain." Everyone in the caravan stilled. Before most of them could process the true meaning of these words, Li Lingjun slowly continued. "At Deer Mountain, before the conference starts, Father King will make me the crown prince." It was not yet spring thunder in the Wu Mountain area, but Li Lingjun's words were like thunder in the ears of everyone in the caravan. Deer Mountain was the border of multiple dynasties. Making the crown prince at Deer Mountain, and Li Lingjun had not officially returned to the Chu capital. The position of crown prince of the Chu dynasty had been empty for decades. From any perspective, this matter was illogical. Yet everyone in the caravan knew Li Lingjun's style of speech and conduct. They noticed that Li Lingjun did not even add the words, "if there are no accidents." He didn't even say these words, which meant that the matter of conferring the title of crown prince was a foregone conclusion. There would be absolutely no accidents. Everyone in the world knew that King Chu was old. Li Lingjun becoming the crown prince was a foregone conclusion. That meant that in the near future, he would be the supreme master of the Chu dynasty. If the master they followed became the emperor of a dynasty, how glorious would the people who followed him be? This was truly the beginning of the end of bitterness. For a moment, most of the people in the convoy knelt on the ground in excitement. Only Li Lingjun was not completely overjoyed. He walked to Lu Sish's side and said in an icy tone, "Kill Su Qin no matter the price. Do not let him leave Chu alive." Lu Sish immediately frowned deeply. At this time, he did not know why he had to kill Su Qin, but he could sense Li Lingjun's great viciousness and hatred. After dinner time, Falling Parasol quickly became quiet and serene. There were not many customers left in the wine shop. Ding Ning cleaned up the table and prepared to close the shop. Fu Su walked into the wine shop at this time. Looking at the busy Ding Ning, he took a cloth and started to help wipe the table. "Since business is good, why don't you hire 2 people? This way, you can have more time to cultivate," Fu Su said with a gentle smile as he looked at Ding Ning, who did not refuse his help. Ding Ning glanced at him and said calmly, "In the view of many people, the most important thing in cultivation is time. They seem to say that if they are born with a lifespan of several hundred years, they will definitely be able to reach Realm 7, or even Realm 8. But in my view, it is because they do not understand cultivation. If they just want to waste time until they have a breakthrough, then they will not be able to have a breakthrough. Many cultivators like this will be white-haired at Realm 5 or 6. At that time, they will feel that the heavens are unfair and cannot let them live for another 500 years. Fu Su frowned slightly. Inexplicably, he felt that Ding Ning's words contained many useful truths. "Then what do you feel is the most important thing in cultivation?" he thought and asked humbly and seriously. Ding Ning looked at him and said, "Naturally, it is the state of mind. When the state of mind is happy, you will feel that everything you do is correct and meaningful. You will not suspect that what you are doing now is useless and a waste of time. Without any hesitation, you will naturally advance bravely." After a pause, he looked at Fu Su, who was deep in thought, and said, "In reality, even if one is crossing a river at night, there are countless paths. But those that cannot cross often suspect they are wrong and stop halfway, or turn back and choose another path to set off. On the other hand, some cultivators who have taken a wrong path but still feel that they are correct and continue to move forward will go further. Fu Su thought carefully about these words and found that they were the same as what his teacher had said. He couldn't help but feel respect and said, "No wonder the outside says that your comprehension is comparable to those monsters of Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate. Why have you come so late?" After cleaning up, Ding Ning brought over a basin of clear water for Fu Su and himself to wash their hands. He said, "Did you come especially to flatter me?" Fu Su laughed and took out a jade wine pot from his sleeve. He said, "Last time, you treated me to wine. This time, it is my turn to treat you." The wine in the jade wine pot was jade in color. When it was poured into the wine cup, it formed a line that gave off a glowing light. As soon as the cup entered his stomach, he felt every drop of wine explode like the fish roe that the nobles in the court liked to eat, giving off a slightly fishy smell. This smell went deep into his organs, but it was like flowers blooming. It made some of the places in his body that had dried up because of too much yang qi seem to be covered in a layer of water. He took a deep breath and looked at Fu Su. He said, "This wine is slightly special." Fu Su smiled and said, "This is good wine, and it is not sold outside. We have stored it at home for a long time. After this pot is finished, there will be no more. So you have to drink more. He is special to you." Deep in the night, seeing Ding Ning return after escorting Fu Su out of the alley, Zhang Sun Qianxue said with slight disdain, "He even brought you the life-prolonging wine made from the 7-heart flower. This is priceless. The entire fish market may not be able to gather the 7-heart flower from overseas to make so much wine in 10 years. If you can give me 3 more years, I will use these 3 years to exchange for cultivation." Ding Ning sensed the medicinal power nourishing the dry places in his body and spoke calmly to her about cultivation. "This will allow me to get closer to Realm 3 First Class before the Min Mountain Sword trials start." Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at him in displeasure and said, "He treats you so well, but you use him. Do you not feel guilty?" "Do not care too much about the process, just the result." Ding Ning looked at her and said, "Even the best process is useless when everyone is dead. Do not keep mentioning these past matters in front of me." Zhang Sun Qianxue's expression turned cold. She said slowly, "You say this because you think many of the things he did in the past were wrong?" Ding Ning nodded and said, "Of course many were wrong." Zhang Sun Qianxue did not like to argue. So while this conversation was the beginning for other people, it was the end for her. She turned and walked into the inner courtyard. Ding Ning did not say anything else. Just like usual, he washed with hot water and then went to bed. The countless little silkworms in his body started to wake up and furiously consumed the energy from the wine. The dry places in his body that had been nourished by the wine dried up again, but at the same time, astounding energies formed in his body. The vital energy in his body grew rapidly at a terrifying speed that ordinary cultivators could not imagine. At this time, it was a waning moon. The moon in the night sky had become a small arc. In the Zhou family ink garden, in Forefather Zhou's room that was as warm as spring all year round, Zhou Susong stood with her head bowed in reverence in front of Forefather Zhou. Looking at this young woman, Forefather Zhou's eyes were filled with complicated emotions. He narrowed his eyes slightly and asked in as amiable a tone as possible, "Your period is ended. Do you feel anything?" Zhou Susong knew that Forefather Zhou was only asking because he was concerned about her progress in cultivating the secret art. But she still blushed and said bashfully, "Forefather, I do not feel anything special." Forefather Zhou's eyes flashed. Before she could react, his withered hands landed on her hands and moved up her arms. Her body trembled slightly, and countless goosebumps appeared on her skin unnaturally. However, she held her breath and did not dare to move. Forefather Zhou's vital energy slowly moved through the 2 paths in her body and sensed the changes in her body in great detail. Yet his expression grew uncontrollably dark. She did not feel any change. He did not feel any change either. No change. This meant that the wine shop youth's understanding was wrong. This was not a secret art suitable for women to cultivate. Or it was possible that the wine shop youth had purposefully lied. Like Li Lingjun, he was filled with viciousness and hatred. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.